Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The first icy drops of rain hit my face as I secured the final knot on my boat. November in Alaska meant darkness came early, and with it, the bone-chilling cold that made every joint in my body ache. The year was 1920, and I'd spent 6 years working the Yukon River outside Nulato. Most folks called it Nulato, but us locals had our own way of saying things. I wiped the moisture from my beard and looked across the choppy water toward the small collection of cabins that made up our fishing settlement. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, barely visible against the darkening sky. My own home was this boat, the River Queen. Not much to look at, but sturdy enough to keep me alive through the harsh Alaskan seasons. My dogs rustled around on deck, getting antsy as the weather turned. I had 3 of them. Bear, the big Malamute mix who'd been with me longest. Patch, with one black spot over his eye, and Rusty, the youngest and most energetic of the bunch. "Settle down, boys," I called, grabbing my rifle from where it leaned against the cabin door. "Just need to check those traps before the storm hits." The muddy shoreline squished under my boots as I disembarked. The dogs followed, eager for the brief run. I'd set traps about a quarter-mile upriver, hoping to catch something to supplement my dwindling food supplies. Winter was coming fast, and I needed every bit of meat I could get. The forest loomed ahead, black spruce and birch trees standing like skeletal sentinels against the grey sky. I pulled my wool cap lower over my ears and trudged forward, my breath forming clouds in front of my face. The dogs ran ahead, occasionally circling back as if to hurry me along. I'm coming, I grumbled, my joints protesting with each step. At 42, I wasn't old, but years of hard labor and cold weather had worn on me. Still, I preferred this life to the crowded cities down south. Up here, a man could breathe. Up here, I answered to no one but myself. The first trap was empty, disturbed by something big enough to trigger it without getting caught. The second held a snowshoe hare, already stiff with death and cold. I reset the trap and tucked the hare into my pack. It was as I approached the third trap that Bear stopped suddenly, his body going rigid, his ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. The other dogs quickly mimicked his stance, all facing the dense trees to my right. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, slowly bringing my rifle up. The forest had gone quiet, no birds, no rustling of small animals, just silence and the soft patter of rain on leaves. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I took a step backward, keeping my eyes on the tree line. "Come on, boys, let's head back." That's when I heard it. A deep, guttural breathing, like nothing I'd ever heard from any animal I knew. It was followed by the crack of breaking branches, too heavy to be anything small. Bear's growl intensified, and Patch began barking frantically. I raised my rifle higher, finger hovering near the trigger. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm armed!" The response was immediate and terrifying. A massive figure burst through the trees with such speed I barely had time to register what I was seeing. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted dark hair. Not a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its arms swinging forward with purpose. Its face was flat, with deep-set eyes that fixed on me with unmistakable intent. Bushman. The word flashed in my mind. The natives spoke of them in hushed tones, creatures that roamed the forests best left undisturbed. I'd always half believed the stories, but now I fired my rifle on instinct, the report deafening in the quiet forest. The creature jerked but didn't fall. Instead it roared, a sound so primal and rage-filled it froze me in place for a crucial second. That second nearly cost me my life. It charged, covering the distance between us in 3 massive strides. I tried to fire again, but it swatted the rifle from my hands with such force that pain shot up to my shoulder. The weapon flew into the underbrush, useless. My dogs launched themselves at the creature, snapping and snarling. Bear latched onto its leg, while Patch and Rusty darted in and out, trying to bite at its flanks. The creature bellowed in anger, kicking Bear away with enough force to send him sliding across the wet ground. I turned to run, but a massive hand grabbed my jacket, yanking me backward with terrible strength. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. Above me, the Bushman loomed, its breath visible in the cold air, its eyes filled with a rage I couldn't comprehend. Its fist came down on my chest. I felt ribs crack. Pain exploded through my body. I tried to roll away, but it grabbed my leg, dragging me along the forest floor. Rocks and branches tore at my back. I clawed at the earth, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. My hand closed around a rock. With all the strength I could muster, I swung it up, connecting with the creature's jaw. It grunted, but didn't release me. Instead, it picked me up like I weighed nothing and threw me against a tree trunk. The impact sent white-hot flashes across my vision. I crumpled to the ground, tasting blood in my mouth. My ribs screamed in protest as I tried to breathe. The creature advanced again, but my dogs intervened, Bear launching himself at the Bushman's throat, while Patch and Rusty attacked from behind. The creature roared, spinning to deal with the new threat. It caught Rusty mid-leap and flung him away like a rag doll. I heard my dog yelp in pain as he hit a tree. Fury gave me strength I didn't know I had. I staggered to my feet, spitting blood. "Come on then, you bastard!" I shouted, grabbing a broken branch from the ground. The Bushman turned back to me, its face contorted in what looked like a snarl. It beat its chest once, the sound like a drum in the quiet forest, then charged again. I swung the branch with all my might, connecting with its head. The wood splintered and broke, barely slowing the creature down. Its arm shot out, catching me across the chest and sending me flying backward once more. I landed hard, something inside me shifting in a way that sent waves of agony through my body. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe without pain tearing through me. The Bushman stood over me, its breath hot on my face. I was certain this was the end. But Bear and Patch hadn't given up. They attacked again, Bear going for the throat while Patch tore at the creature's calf. The Bushman bellowed in pain, reaching down to grab Patch. I summoned my last reserves of strength and kicked upward, connecting with the creature's knee. There was a crack, and it staggered slightly. Just enough for Bear to get a better grip on its shoulder. Blood flowed from where Bear's teeth tore into the Bushman's flesh. It howled, a sound that echoed through the trees and seemed to shake the very ground. Then suddenly it shoved away from us, with one last look, a look that burned into my memory with its hatred and intelligence. It turned and crashed back into the forest. I lay there, rain falling on my face, mixing with blood and sweat. Every breath was agony. Something was very wrong inside me. Bear limped to my side, whining softly as he nudged my hand. "Good boy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Good dogs." I knew I needed to move, to get back to my boat, to find help, but my body refused to cooperate. The pain was too intense, too all-encompassing. I'm not sure how long I lay there before I managed to roll onto my side. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through me, and I vomited blood onto the forest floor. Not good. Not good at all. Bear barked, then ran a few paces toward the river before coming back to me. Patch joined him, both dogs clearly trying to get me moving. "All right, boys," I gasped. "Let's try." I crawled. There was no other way to describe it. Like a child, I pulled myself along the wet ground inch by agonizing inch. The dogs stayed with me, sometimes pulling at my clothing as if trying to help. Rusty eventually rejoined us, limping badly but alive. The sight of him gave me a small burst of determination. We moved painfully slowly toward the river, toward my boat, toward any chance of survival. It took hours. The rain continued to fall, soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. By the time I reached the shore, darkness had fully descended. I could just make out the outline of the River Queen, moored where I'd left her. but the distance seemed impossible. 20 yards of water separated me from my boat, from my radio, from any hope of calling for help. I collapsed at the water's edge, coughing up more blood. My vision swam, darkness encroaching at the edges. "Help!" I tried to call, but it came out as little more than a wheeze. Bear barked loudly, again and again. Patch and Rusty joined in, their voices carrying across the water. It was my only hope that someone might hear them, might come investigate. I don't know how long they barked. Time seemed to stretch and compress. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the cold seeping deeper into my bones with each passing minute. Then, miraculously, voices, a lantern bobbing across the water, Jim Taylor's small boat approaching the shore. "Albert? That you?" Jim's voice sounded distant, though he was just feet away now. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" Hands lifted me, pain flaring with each movement. I screamed, I think, though it might have just been in my head. "Bushman!" I managed to gasp as they loaded me into Jim's boat. "Attacked me, up by the traps." "Save your strength," Jim said, his face pale in the lantern light. "We'll get you to Doc Williams." The journey back to the settlement passed in a blur of pain and disjointed images. My dogs followed along the shoreline, unwilling to leave me. I heard people shouting, felt myself being carried again, then the relative warmth of a cabin. Doc Williams' face swam into view, his expression grave as he cut away my clothing and examined my injuries. "Internal bleeding," I heard him mutter. "Several broken ribs, punctured lung most likely." I grabbed his wrist with what little strength I had left. "Listen," I wheezed. "Need to tell what happened." And so I did. As Doc worked to save me, as neighbors gathered in the small cabin, I recounted every detail of the attack. The size of the creature, the intelligence in its eyes, the ferocity of its assault. Some faces showed disbelief, others fear. The native folks nodded solemnly. They'd known all along what lurked in the forests. "Never seen anything so strong," I managed between painful breaths. "Not a bear. Walked like a man, but not a man." "Save your strength, Albert," Doc Williams urged, but I knew it was too late for that. The pain was fading now, replaced by a cold numbness that spread from my core outward. Not a good sign. I'd seen enough men die to know what was happening. "My dogs," I said, fixing my gaze on Jim. "Take care of my dogs." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will, Albert, I swear it." I closed my eyes, exhaustion overtaking me. The voices around me grew distant, as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. I thought of the creature, the Bushman, and wondered why it had attacked me. Had I unknowingly crossed into its territory? Was it protecting something? Or was it simply the malevolent being the natives described in their stories? I would never know. The darkness grew deeper, the pain receded further. My last thoughts were of my dogs, who had fought so bravely, who had saved me from being torn apart in those woods. Thanks to them, I'd lived long enough to warn others, to tell my story, to make sure everyone in Nulado knew that the Bushman was real, and that it was watching us from the trees. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. For me, it was just that creature's face, those eyes that held something too human for comfort and too alien for understanding. As I slipped away, I heard Bear howling outside the cabin, a mournful sound that followed me into the darkness. Albert Petka died on November 12, 1920, in a small fishing settlement outside Nulado, Alaska. His story spread quickly along the Yukon, a cautionary tale for those who ventured too far into the wilderness alone. The locals buried him on a small rise overlooking the river he'd loved, his dogs keeping vigil by his grave until Jim Taylor finally coaxed them away. And in the forests around Nulado, something large continued to move among the trees, watching and waiting for its next encounter with the fragile humans who dared to make their homes along its river. Story 2. The morning air bit at my face as I loaded the last of our gear into the John boat. Michael tossed the cooler in behind me, its weight shifting the small aluminum craft in the shallow water. It was early June 1996, and like every year before, we'd made our annual pilgrimage to our favorite fishing spot along the Yukon River. As Koyukon Athabascans, the river wasn't just recreation for us, it was in our blood, part of who we were. "George, did you grab the extra line?" Michael asked, rubbing his hands together against the morning chill. "Got it right here," I said, patting the tackle box. "Plus some new lures I picked up in Fairbanks last month." The sun barely peeked over the eastern horizon as we pushed off from the muddy bank. The outboard motor sputtered to life on the second pull, not bad for the old Mercury we'd been nursing along for the past decade. Our breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the morning light as we made our way upriver. I guided the boat through the slow current, passing beneath overhanging branches and around protruding logs. The familiar route took us about 45 minutes upstream from our launch point near Beaver Creek. This was our spot, had been for years. Far enough from the village that we wouldn't run into other fishermen, but not so remote we couldn't get back before dark. Michael pointed to a clearing on the north bank. "There it is." I cut the engine and let the boat drift toward our usual spot, a gentle eddy protected by a fallen spruce that created a perfect pocket for king salmon to rest in their journey upstream. "Water's higher than last year," I noted, securing the boat to a sturdy branch jutting from the riverbank. "Spring melt came late," Michael said, already sorting through his gear. "Should mean the kings are running strong." We settled into our familiar routine. The only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the aluminum hull, the occasional splash of our lures hitting the water, and the soft clicks of our reels as we cast and retrieved. For nearly 2 hours, we worked the eddy, pulling in a respectable 4 kings between us. The first odd sound came just as I was reaching into the cooler for a sandwich. "Did you hear that?" I asked, freezing with my hand still inside the cooler. Michael paused, his line going slack. "Hear what?" Then it came again, a high-pitched whistle from somewhere in the trees along the shoreline, maybe 50 yards downriver from where we were anchored. "That," I said, "sounds like some kind of bird." Michael shrugged. "Probably just a varied thrush. They've got that weird call." I nodded, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too controlled, too deliberate for a bird call. Still, I pushed the thought away and returned to my sandwich. We ate in silence, but the whistling came again, this time answered by another similar sound from farther downriver. "That's no thrush," Michael said, no longer dismissive. "Maybe some kids from the village followed us up?" "This far out?" "Not likely," I replied, scanning the tree line for movement. The whistling continued intermittently for another 15 minutes as we resumed fishing, though my attention was more on the shore than my line. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whistling stopped. The silence felt heavier somehow, more tense. The first splash came from behind us, a distinct plop that wasn't the natural sound of a fish jumping or debris falling into the water. I turned just in time to see ripples spreading where something had hit the water about 10 feet from our boat. "What was—" I started to say when another splash cut me off, this time closer. Michael reeled in his line quickly. "Someone's throwing rocks at us." I was about to agree when I saw movement at the tree line. At first I thought it might be moose. They were common enough along this stretch of river, but as the shapes emerged from the shadows of the spruce and birch, my blood went cold. They weren't moose. They weren't bears. They weren't human, at least not fully. 2 massive figures stepped out from between the trees. Even at a distance of about 40 yards, their size was shocking. They stood upright on 2 legs, their bodies covered in dark, almost black hair. Their shoulders were impossibly broad, their arms hanging longer than any man's would. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered beside me. "Are those—" Bushman, I finished, the word barely making it past my lips. Everyone in our village grew up with stories of the Bushmen. The elders warned us about places in the forest where they lived, places we shouldn't go. But like most of my generation, I'd written them off as legends meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. Now, watching these creatures move with purpose toward the riverbank, those childhood fears came rushing back with awful clarity. The Bushmen moved quickly despite their size, reaching the water's edge in seconds. Without hesitation, they waded in, the river reaching only to their waists, even though I knew that section was at least 5 feet deep. Their faces were obscured by hair, but I could make out their eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed directly on us. "Start the motor," I hissed to Michael. "It's still tied to the tree," he replied, his voice shaking. I turned to untie the rope, keeping my eyes on the creatures. That's when I saw the first one bend down, reach below the water's surface, and pull up a rock the size of a grapefruit. With a motion too fluid for its massive frame, it hurled the stone toward us. The rock sailed over our heads, missing by several feet, but the message was clear. This was no accident, no curious animal behavior. They were attacking us deliberately. "Hurry!" Michael urged as he fumbled with the starter cord. The second Bushman had now gathered its own ammunition. This one took more time, adjusting its stance in the water, and threw with frightening accuracy. The rock smashed into the side of our boat with a deafening clang, denting the aluminum and sending vibrations through the hull. My fingers finally worked the knot free, just as Michael gave the cord another desperate pull. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. Meanwhile, the Bushmen had established a rhythm. One would throw, while the other collected rocks from the riverbed. The efficiency of their teamwork was terrifying. There was clear intelligence behind their actions, a strategy. They weren't just acting on instinct, they were coordinating. A rock splashed just inches from the bow. Another narrowly missed Michael's head. "Come on, you piece of junk," Michael growled, pulling the cord again. This time, the engine caught, roaring to life. I quickly moved to the center of the boat, grabbing the tiller and twisting it to turn us downstream. The boat lurched forward, but not before another rock slammed into the outboard motor itself, the impact nearly stalling it again. As we pulled away from the shore, I glanced back. The sight froze my insides. The Bushmen were moving again, not retreating, but following us downriver. Their gait was a powerful, loping run, somehow both awkward and frighteningly fast. They moved through the shallow water at the river's edge, occasionally disappearing behind trees, only to emerge again, always keeping pace. "They're following us!" I shouted over the engine's roar. Michael turned to look, his face draining of color. "Go faster!" I opened the throttle as much as I dared, navigating the river's curves with reckless speed. The boat bounced over small waves, nearly capsizing when we hit a submerged log. Still, the Bushmen kept pace, visible through gaps in the trees. For what felt like hours but must have been only minutes, this terrifying chase continued. I kept the boat's speed as high as I dared, swerving to avoid obstacles, while Michael kept watch on our pursuers. Then, after we rounded a particularly sharp bend in the river, Michael reported they were no longer visible. "I don't see them anymore," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't slow down, not yet. Only after another quarter-mile of river had passed beneath us did I ease off the throttle slightly, allowing myself to breathe. "You think we lost them?" Michael asked. "I don't know," I admitted, still scanning the shoreline frantically, "but I'm not stopping to find out." We continued downstream at a rapid pace until we reached our launch point. My hands shook as I guided the boat to shore, and my legs nearly buckled when I stepped onto solid ground. Michael looked no better. His face was ashen, his movements jerky as we secured the boat and loaded our gear into the truck. Neither of us spoke as we drove back to the village. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road, and every dark shape among the trees made my heart race. It wasn't until we were inside Michael's kitchen, door locked behind us, that we finally tried to process what had happened. "Those were Bushmen," Michael stated flatly, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd made but hadn't touched. "Actual Bushmen." I nodded, unable to deny what we'd both seen. They were hunting us, or defending their territory. "The way they worked together," Michael said, shaking his head. "One throwing, one gathering. That wasn't animal behavior." "And the whistling," I added. "They were communicating, coordinating." We sat in silence for a long while. Outside, the day continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, our world had shifted irrevocably. News of our encounter spread quickly through the village. Some of the younger folks dismissed our story as exaggeration or the result of too many beers on the river. But the elders nodded knowingly. Old Man Jimmy, who rarely spoke at community gatherings anymore, stood up the next evening at the community hall. "The Yellow Hand brothers saw what they saw," he announced, his voice surprisingly strong. "My grandfather told me of the rock throwers when I was a boy. They guard their fishing spots, always have. The river provides for all, but some places belong to them." Others came forward with their own stories. Distant sightings, strange noises in the woods, tracks found in remote areas. Stories they'd been hesitant to share for fear of ridicule. In the days that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows and avoiding windows after dark. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of massive figures wading through water, their eyes fixed on me with terrible purpose. Michael seemed to process the encounter differently. He became obsessed with researching similar incidents, calling contacts in other villages, even reaching out to a professor at the University of Alaska who studied Bushman legends. "They've been documented all over this region," he told me one evening, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "Going back hundreds of years. The Russians even wrote about them in their early explorations." I nodded, but said little. The details didn't matter to me. I knew what I'd seen. A week after the incident, Michael suggested we go back, this time with cameras and more people. "No," I said firmly. "I'm never going back to that spot." "But George, don't you see? We could prove what we saw. We could—" "I don't care about proof," I cut him off. "I care about staying alive. Those things could have killed us if they'd wanted to. Maybe next time they will." Michael fell silent, studying my face. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay, no return trip." Summer progressed. I still fished, but only in spots close to the village, always with others, never alone. Michael eventually stopped bringing up the incident, though I sometimes caught him looking pensively toward the river when he thought no one was watching. As for me, I kept my story simple when asked. Yes, we saw Bushmen. Yes, they threw rocks at us. No, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Eventually, people stopped asking, but I never forgot. How could I? The image of those massive figures emerging from the tree line is burned into my memory. Their coordinated movements, their obvious intelligence, their territorial rage. Some nights I still wake up to the phantom sound of whistling coming from just beyond my window. The river continues to flow as it always has. The salmon return each year to spawn. Life in our small village moves forward, but something fundamental changed for me that day in 1996. The world became bigger, older, more mysterious. And I learned that sometimes the legends we dismiss as children's stories carry more truth than we're prepared to face. I haven't told this full account to many people. Writing it down now feels like releasing a burden I've carried for years. I don't know if the Bushmen still patrol that stretch of river. I don't know if other fishermen have encountered them since. And I don't want to know. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some territories aren't ours to claim. The Bushmen taught me that lesson with rocks thrown from powerful hands. It's a lesson I won't forget no matter how many years pass. Story 3. The blood on my hands had dried to a rust-colored crust beneath my fingernails. 3 days since I'd last seen another human face, and the forest around me had transformed from a place of commerce to a prison of endless trees. My throat burned with thirst, despite the humid air that clung to my buckskins like a second skin. The warning from old Shawnee John echoed in my mind as I stumbled forward, my compass spinning uselessly in my palm. "Stay south of Bear Creek, Caleb. Bad spirits walk in the North Valley." I was a fool. Pride comes before the fall, my pa always said. Now I understood. My name is Caleb Thatcher, trapper by trade, and I'm writing this account in the hope someone finds it should I not make it back to Wellington Station. The year is 1743, and I've wandered into what the Shawnee call forbidden lands. Something follows me now, something hungry. It started 7 days ago when I met with the other traders at the outpost. Jack Miller had brought in 3 dozen beaver pelts from a territory he claimed was untouched. Said he found them north of the ridge where the Shawnee warned us not to go. "Richest trapping I ever seen," Jack boasted, tobacco juice staining his beard as he spat into the dirt. "Them Indians just want to keep the good spots for themselves." Sam Holcomb, the oldest among us at 53 years, shook his head. "3 men gone missing up that way last season. Indians ain't the type to make up stories just to fool white men." Jack laughed, counting his coins from the sale. "Superstitious nonsense. Probably bears got those men, or they just moved on to better territory." I'd been having a poor season. The usual streams were trapped out, and I needed pelts if I wanted to eat through winter. The French buyer offered double price for quality beaver, and my stomach had been growling for days on jerky and wild onions. "I'm heading up there tomorrow," I announced. "Northwest Fork, past the Twin Bluffs." Sam grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "You listen to me, boy. The Shawnee call it loup-garou, wolf that walks like a man. They've lost warriors to it for generations." I pulled away. I ain't afraid of no wolf. That night, Shawnee John came to my fire. He wasn't tribal chief, but the Indians respected him, and he'd learned enough English to trade with us. He sat without invitation and stared at me across the flames. "You go north," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need pelts," I replied simply. He nodded slowly. 3 days only, then leave. When sun touches tallest ridge, you must be walking south, no matter what." "Why 3 days?" I asked. "They hunt when moon grows full." I glanced upward at the waxing moon. 3 days would take it to nearly full. "What hunts up there, John?" His dark eyes reflected the firelight. "Old ones, before Shawnee, before all men. They let us live here because we respect boundaries. White men do not." I laughed nervously. "You mean bears? Mountain lions?" He stood abruptly. 3 days, then south, or join the lost ones. In the morning I packed my traps, rifle, powder and provisions. Should have listened, should have stayed with the others. But coin speaks louder than caution to a hungry man. The first 2 days were everything Jack promised. I set 20 traps along a pristine stream and caught 18 beaver. Their pelts were thick and unmarked, prime trading goods. I made camp the second night feeling vindicated. The Shawnee were protecting their hunting grounds after all. On the 3rd day, I woke to fog so thick I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Something felt wrong. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no squirrels chattering in the trees, just the drip of condensation from leaves. I packed my gear quickly, remembering John's warning. 3 days. Time to head south. But when I pulled out my compass, the needle spun wildly, unable to find north. I tried moving to different spots, but it kept spinning. "Hell and damnation," I muttered, tucking it away. I'd have to navigate by the sun, but the fog showed no signs of lifting. I shouldered my pack and headed in what I hoped was a southerly direction, using the slope of the land as my guide. Water flows downhill, and the trading post was in the valley. By midday, the fog still hadn't cleared, but thinned enough that I could make out the general shape of the terrain. I didn't recognize any landmarks. The trees seemed larger here, older, with sprawling roots that rose from the ground like sleeping serpents. My boot caught on one such root, sending me tumbling down a short embankment into a clearing. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was the remains of an Indian camp. Bones hung from the lower branches of trees. Deer bones, I assumed, until I spotted a human skull dangling among them. Not just one. Dozens. The clearing was a charnel house of human remains, picked clean and arranged in some terrible pattern I couldn't comprehend. My stomach heaved. I emptied its meager contents onto the forest floor as I scrambled backward. My rifle slipped from my shoulder and clattered among the rocks. When I reached for it, my hand came away sticky with something dark that wasn't mud. The entire clearing smelled of rot and something else. A musky animal scent that made the hair on my neck stand up. I grabbed my rifle and ran, no longer caring which direction was south. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. Collapsing against a fallen tree, I fought to catch my breath. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. No wind rustled the leaves. No animals moved in the underbrush. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I raised my rifle, spinning in a circle, searching for the source. "Who's there?" I called, immediately regretting making noise. The growl came again, closer this time. I backed up against a large oak, trying to protect my flank. A twig snapped to my left. I fired into the undergrowth without thinking. The shot echoed through the trees, momentarily breaking the unnatural silence. Then nothing. I reloaded quickly, fingers fumbling with the powder. The forest remained still. Perhaps I'd scared it off, whatever it was. A wolf, most likely, or a mountain lion. Nothing more. Night was approaching. I needed shelter. Moving cautiously, I found a small outcropping of rock that would protect my back and gathered enough wood for a fire. The flames provided little comfort as darkness fell completely. The moon rose, nearly full now, casting silver light through the canopy. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch brought me upright, rifle ready. Sometime in the deepest part of night, I heard it again. Not a growl this time, but a howl. Long, mournful, but not like any wolf I'd ever heard. It held notes that were almost human. Another howl answered from a different direction. Then another. 3 of them, circling my position. Sweat ran cold down my back, despite the fire's heat. I threw more wood on the flames, hoping the light would keep them at bay. Wild animals fear fire. This is the wisdom of frontiersmen. But these were not ordinary wolves. The first one appeared at the edge of the firelight, a massive shadow, taller than any wolf had right to be. It stood on its hind legs, shoulders hunched forward, arms hanging at its sides. Yes, arms, not forelegs. Its shape was a mockery of human form, covered in dark fur, but its head was pure wolf, elongated snout, pointed ears, eyes that reflected the firelight like yellow lamps. I raised my rifle, hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an intelligence no animal should possess. Its jaws parted, revealing rows of gleaming teeth. I fired. The creature jerked backward as the ball found its mark, but didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the bleeding wound in its chest, then back at me. A sound came from its throat. Not a growl, but a laugh. A human laugh distorted through an animal's vocal cords. I dropped the rifle and drew my hunting knife, useless against such a beast, but the only defense I had left. The creature stepped forward into the full light of the fire. Now I could see details I wish I hadn't. The hands ending in curved claws, the twisted musculature that allowed it to stand upright, the scraps of what might once have been clothing hanging from its body. "What are you?" I whispered. It cocked its head again, as if considering the question. Then it spoke, a single word in a voice like stones grinding together. "Hungry." I ran. Blind panic drove me deeper into the forest, away from the firelight, away from any hope of orientation. Branches whipped my face. Rocks turned beneath my feet. I could hear them behind me, not just one now, but all three, crashing through the underbrush, their breathing heavy but not labored. They were toying with me. I realized this with cold certainty. They could have overtaken me at any time. Ahead, the trees thinned. A river glimmered in the moonlight. Water meant people, eventually. If I could follow it downstream, perhaps I'd find a settlement or at least familiar territory. I splashed into the current, gasping at the cold that soaked through my buckskins. The water reached my waist at its deepest point. I fought against the pull, making for the opposite bank. When I looked back, they stood at the water's edge. All three watched me, making no move to follow. Something about the water stopped them. A boundary, perhaps. The one I'd shot lifted its muzzle and howled again. This time the sound carried notes of frustration. I collapsed on the far bank, shivering from cold and fear. The creatures paced along the water's edge for an hour before melting back into the forest. I didn't trust their departure, but couldn't bring myself to move just yet. Dawn found me still huddled by the river, knife clutched in my frozen fingers. The morning light revealed no signs of my pursuers. I stood on shaky legs and studied my surroundings. The river cut through a valley I didn't recognize, but it flowed southeast according to the sun's position. Following it would take me back to settled lands eventually. I walked all day, stopping only to drink and to check that I wasn't followed. By late afternoon, the forest began to look familiar. I recognized the bend in the river where Jack and I had fished the previous spring. Another 2 hours' walk would bring me to Wellington Station. Relief weakened my knees. I'd survived. The station meant people, weapons, walls, safety. That's when I smelled smoke. Not the welcoming smoke of hearths and cook fires, but the acrid stench of disaster. I broke into a run, following the river's final curve before it opened into the settlement. Wellington Station was burning. Flames engulfed the trading post and 3 outlying cabins. No one moved among the buildings, no shouts for water, no organized effort to contain the blaze. I approached cautiously, rifle raised, though I had no shot loaded. The main gate hung open, one hinge broken. Inside, bodies littered the ground. Not just men, but women and children too. They hadn't been shot or taken by Indians. They'd been torn apart. Blood darkened the dirt everywhere. Entrails spilled from ragged abdominal wounds. Limbs lay separated from torsos. Some victims had been partially eaten. I found Jack's body near the trading post steps. His face was frozen in terror, throat torn out, chest cavity emptied of organs. Beside him lay Sam, the old trapper's head completely severed from his body. They'd followed me. Somehow they'd tracked me despite the river crossing, but they hadn't pursued me. They'd come straight here instead. A sound behind me, the crack of a branch. I spun, raising my useless rifle. Shawnee John stood at the edge of the clearing, 3 warriors beside him. Their faces were painted black. They carried bows with arrows nocked, but hadn't drawn them. "You crossed boundary," John said flatly. "Broke ancient agreement." "I didn't know," I stammered. "They followed me." John shook his head. "Not follow. You opened path. They smelled many humans. Better hunting." "Why didn't you warn us properly?" I shouted, gesturing at the carnage. "You knew what would happen." "We warned. White men no listen." John pointed upriver. "Now we burn everything. Salt earth. Pray they go back to their hunting grounds." "What are they?" John's face remained impassive. "First ones. They were here before. Will be here after. We learned to live apart. You broke barrier." One of the warriors said something in their language. John nodded. "You come now, help make offering. Maybe they accept and retreat." Offering. My mouth went dry. Blood pays for blood. His eyes held no mercy. One open door must close it. I ran again, away from the burning settlement, away from John and his warriors. Their arrows hissed past me, one grazing my arm. I kept running until the sounds of pursuit faded. That was 3 days ago. I've been moving south ever since, through unfamiliar territory. My provisions are gone. The wound on my arm festers, and each night I hear howling in the distance. They're hunting me. John's people or the wolf things. I don't know which will find me first. Maybe it doesn't matter. Tonight is the full moon. I've found a cave where I'll make my stand. If someone finds this journal, tell my sister in Boston what happened here. Tell the authorities to burn the forest north of Bear Creek. Tell them some doors should remain closed. The sun is setting now. I hear movement in the undergrowth. Heavy footsteps. Not human. They've found me. Story 4. The evening sun filtered through the pine trees as I sat on the front porch of the Wilson house, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. My cousin Jake sat beside me, both of us sipping lemonade from sweating glasses while waiting for Tommy to return from his daily ride. The late July heat pressed down on us, making the air thick and heavy around Grand Rivers. We'd come to visit for the summer break, like we did every year, but this time Tommy had a new toy, a Yamaha dirt bike his dad had bought him for his 14th birthday. He's been out longer than usual, I said, checking my watch. 6:45 p.m. Tommy normally returned before dinner. Jake shrugged, swatting at a mosquito. Probably found a new trail. You know how he gets. The evening bugs had just started their chorus when we heard it, the high-pitched whine of Tommy's motorcycle engine, but something was wrong. The engine screamed at full throttle, not the casual putt-putt of a leisurely return home. "That's Tommy," I said, standing up. "Something's wrong." Jake was on his feet too as we moved to the edge of the porch. The sound grew louder, more frantic. Then Tommy burst through the tree line at the edge of the property, his bike airborne for a second, before landing hard on the grass, completely missing the dirt access road that led to the house. He was hunched over the handlebars, his knuckles white with strain. When he was 20 yards from the porch, Tommy did something I'd never seen before. He deliberately kicked the bike out from under him, sending it skidding across the lawn while he tumbled and rolled in the opposite direction. "Tommy!" I screamed, running down the steps with Jake right behind me. My brother scrambled to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. He limped toward us, constantly looking back at the woods he'd just fled. "We got to get inside," he gasped, grabbing my arm. "Now!" "What happened?" Jake asked, gripping Tommy's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Tommy opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a sound erupted from the forest edge. It wasn't a howl or a scream exactly, it was something between the two, high-pitched yet guttural, rising and falling in a way that made my skin prickle. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard around LBL. It didn't sound human either. Tommy's fingers dug into my arm. "It's still coming," he whispered. That's when I noticed the tear in his jeans, a long rip down his right thigh. The denim was darkened with something wet, blood. It seeped through the fabric, trickling down his leg. "Jesus, Tommy, what happened to you?" Jake's voice cracked. Tommy was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Something grabbed me," he said. "In the woods, near Huckleberry Creek. I was just riding the trail, and then it came out of nowhere." "What came out of nowhere?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," Tommy said, his voice tight with pain. "It was big, really big, and fast. I felt its claws." He touched his bleeding leg. It tried to pull me off the bike. The mercury vapor security light on the pole near the barn flickered on as dusk settled around us, casting a harsh blue-white glow over the yard. Tommy suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on something beyond me. Jake and I turned to look. At the edge of the woods, just outside the reach of the security light, stood a figure. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its body looked almost human, with 2 arms and legs. But something was wrong about the proportions. Its limbs were too long, joints bent at unusual angles, but it was the head that made my heart stop. It wasn't human at all. In the deepening shadows, I could make out a muzzle, pointed ears standing straight up, like a dog or a wolf, but massive, sitting atop that human-like body. "Inside," Jake whispered, tugging at my sleeve. "Inside now." We turned and ran for the house, Tommy limping between us. I glanced back once and saw the figure still standing there, watching us. It took a step forward, into the dim edge of the security light's glow, and I caught a flash of black fur before we reached the porch. Jake slammed the front door behind us and twisted the deadbolt. "Where's your dad's shotgun?" he asked Tommy. "Gun cabinet in their bedroom," Tommy gasped, leaning against the wall. "But it's locked." "Knives," I said, already moving toward the kitchen. "We need something." The kitchen was dark. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking so badly I missed it twice. When the fluorescence flickered on, I yanked open the drawer where Aunt Elaine kept the cutting knives and grabbed 3, the biggest ones I could find. A thump from outside made me jump. Something had hit the side of the house. Jake appeared in the doorway. "It's circling the house," he whispered. "I can hear it." I handed him a knife, then took the other 2 back to Tommy, who'd slid down the wall to sit on the floor in the hallway. His face was ashen, and the blood on his jeans had spread. "We need to hide," he said, taking the knife with trembling fingers. "Mom's room, under the bed." It seemed childish, hiding under a bed, but nothing about this night was normal. We helped Tommy to his feet and made our way to Aunt Elaine's bedroom at the back of the house. The master bedroom had a huge oak bed frame with about 18 inches of clearance underneath. We squeezed under it, Tommy in the middle, Jake and me on either side, our knives clutched in sweaty hands. "What is that thing?" I whispered. Tommy shook his head. "I don't know. I was just riding along the trail near the creek, and I heard something running in the woods beside me. I thought it was a deer at first, but it was keeping pace with the bike. Then it just lunged at me. I felt its claws tear my leg. I gunned the engine and it chased me all the way home." "Did you see its face?" Jake asked. Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. "For a second, when it grabbed me, it had these eyes, yellow eyes and teeth, so many teeth." A loud crash from the front of the house made us all flinch. The sound of breaking glass followed. "It's inside," I whispered, my fingers tightening around the knife handle. Heavy footsteps crossed the living room floor, slow, deliberate steps, nothing like a person's gait. Each footfall made a strange clicking sound like nails or claws on the hardwood. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears. Tommy was trembling beside me, his breathing shallow and fast. Jake had gone completely still, holding his breath. The footsteps moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms. They paused outside Aunt Elaine's door, which we'd left partially open. I saw a shadow fall across the floor as something blocked the hall light. A low growl vibrated through the air, not the sound a dog makes, but deeper, with an almost human quality to it. The door creaked open wider. I caught a glimpse of a massive clawed foot stepping into the room. Black fur covered the ankle and calf, tapering into what looked like bare, greyish skin. The claws clicked against the wood floor as it took another step. And then, from outside, came the sound of a car horn. 3 short blasts. Aunt Elaine signaled that she was home from grocery shopping and wanted help unloading the car. The creature in the bedroom went rigid. The horn blared again. Suddenly, it turned and bolted from the room. We heard it racing through the house, back toward the broken window. There was a crash, more breaking glass, and then silence. We remained frozen under the bed, none of us willing to move. The front door opened. "Tommy, Melissa, Jake, where are you kids? I need help with these groceries," Aunt Elaine called out. Jake was the first to crawl out. "Aunt Elaine," he said, his voice cracking. "In here!" Aunt Elaine appeared in the doorway, confusion on her face. "What on earth are you all doing under the bed? And what happened to my living room window?" We tumbled out, Tommy wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. Aunt Elaine's eyes widened when she saw the blood. "Tommy, what happened?" "Something attacked him in the woods," I said, the words tumbling out. "It chased him home. It was in the house, Aunt Elaine. It broke the window." Aunt Elaine's face went pale. She knelt beside Tommy, examining his leg. "These are deep. You need stitches." Mom, it wasn't a normal animal, Tommy insisted. It was huge. It walked on two legs. It had a wolf's head. Aunt Elaine's expression tightened. Let's get your leg cleaned up first, she said, helping him to his feet. Jake, call the sheriff. While Aunt Elaine cleaned and bandaged Tommy's wounds in the bathroom, Jake called the police. I stood guard at the broken window, knife still in hand, watching the tree line. The creature was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was still out there watching us. Sheriff Dougherty arrived 30 minutes later. He listened to our story with a skeptical expression, taking notes in a small pad. Probably a black bear, he said when we'd finished. They've been known to get aggressive, especially if they're hungry. It wasn't a bear, Tommy insisted. It was standing on two legs the whole time. It had a wolf's head. Sheriff Dougherty exchanged a look with Aunt Elaine. Son, you were scared and it was getting dark. Mind plays tricks on you. We all saw it, Jake said firmly. The sheriff sighed. I'll have my deputies keep an eye out for any unusual animal activity. In the meantime, you kids stay out of those woods. After the sheriff left, Aunt Elaine made us hot chocolate, though none of us felt much like drinking it. We sat at the kitchen table, jumping at every sound from outside. Where's Dad? Tommy asked after a while. Working late at the sawmill, Aunt Elaine said. He should be home soon. Uncle Ray arrived just after 10, his truck tires crunching on the gravel driveway. He came through the door smelling of sawdust and sweat, his expression changing from tired to alert when he saw our faces and the plywood he'd have to nail over the broken window. What happened? He asked, setting down his lunch pail. Aunt Elaine filled him in while he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down heavily at the table. You kids saw this thing clearly? He asked. We nodded. Uncle Ray ran a hand through his thinning hair. I found something strange at work today, he said slowly. Out behind the old storage shed. A pile of bones. What kind of bones? Aunt Elaine asked. Animal bones, mostly. Deer, maybe some livestock. But they were, arranged. In a pile. Like someone, or something, had been collecting them. Tommy's face went even paler. Dad, this thing, it wasn't normal. Uncle Ray nodded. The old-timers around here have stories, he said, about the land between the lakes, things that live in the deep woods, things that been there since before the white settlers came. Ray, Aunt Elaine warned, don't you go filling their heads with those old legends? Uncle Ray looked at her. Legends come from somewhere, Elaine. He turned back to us. The Cherokee called it the Dogman, said it hunted in these woods for centuries. Most folks nowadays think it's just stories to scare children away from wandering too far. But my daddy swore he saw one back in 52. That's enough, Aunt Elaine said firmly. Whatever it was, it's gone now. And you three, she looked at each of us, are staying out of those woods. No more motorcycle rides alone, Tommy. No more hikes. You hear me? We nodded, all too eager to agree. Uncle Ray went out to board up the broken window while Aunt Elaine made up the sofa for Jake to sleep on. Usually he'd stay in Tommy's room, but tonight Tommy asked if I would stay with him instead. I didn't argue. Neither of us wanted to be alone. As I lay in the makeshift pallet on Tommy's floor, listening to his uneven breathing, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The shape at the edge of the woods, the clawed foot in the bedroom, the inhuman scream that still echoed in my ears. Melissa, Tommy whispered from his bed. You awake? Yeah. Do you think it'll come back? I wanted to lie, to tell him of course not, that everything would be fine. But the image of those yellow eyes that Tommy had described was burned into my mind. I don't know, I said honestly. But if it does, we'll be ready. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. The way it moved, he finally said. It wasn't like an animal. It knew what it was doing. It was hunting me. I thought about the pile of bones Uncle Ray had found at the sawmill. "We're not going back in those woods," I said. "No," Tommy agreed. "Never again." Outside, the night wind rustled through the trees at the edge of the property. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Normal night sounds of rural Kentucky, but beneath them I thought I heard something else, a low, mournful howl that didn't belong to any coyote or wolf that roamed these parts. I gripped my knife tighter and stared at the ceiling until morning came. Story 5. The beer tasted warm, but we didn't care. 6 of us crammed around that small campfire in the woods of land between the lakes, passing around a couple of six-packs and laughing about Professor Wilkins' ridiculous toupee. It was early 1973, a Friday night in February, cold but not unbearable. We'd driven out in Marcus's old VW microbus, a rusted orange thing he'd bought for $400 from some hippie heading west. "I'm telling you, it moved 3 inches to the left during his lecture," Devon insisted, his glasses reflecting the campfire flames. "Like a furry animal trying to escape." Carla snorted beer through her nose, which made Lucia double over with laughter. Tyler poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I took another swig from my can, feeling the buzz settling in nicely. "Hey, anybody got the time?" I asked, realizing I'd left my watch in the van. "About 11:30, Marcus said, checking his wrist. "Why, you got a hot date waiting somewhere, Jason?" Everyone laughed. I stood up, feeling the beer pressing against my bladder. "Yeah, with a tree. Gotta take a leak." I walked away from our clearing, the firelight fading behind me as I moved between the trees. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional crackle from our campfire and the distant hoot of an owl. The moon cast enough light to see where I was going, but just barely. I found a suitable tree about 50 yards from camp and unzipped my jeans. The relief felt good. I stared up at the patches of night sky visible through the bare winter branches. That's when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not the casual kind, but the intense, predatory kind that makes the hair on your neck stand straight up. I turned my head slowly, still midstream, and froze. 20 yards away, between 2 massive oak trees, a pair of glowing red eyes stared directly at me. Not the reflected eyes of a deer or raccoon. These were actively glowing, like 2 burning coals hovering about 4 feet off the ground. I quickly zipped up, heart hammering against my ribs. A rustling sound came from my left, then my right. Leaves crunched as multiple somethings, moved around me in the darkness. I heard a distinct sniffing sound, like a large dog testing the air, but deeper and more guttural than any canine I'd ever encountered. "Hello!" I called out stupidly, as if whatever owned those eyes might politely respond. The eyes blinked once, then seemed to lower slightly, as if the creature was crouching. That broke my paralysis. I turned and half ran, half stumbled back toward the campfire, branches whipping across my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I burst into the clearing, panting and wide-eyed. My 5 friends looked up at me in surprise. "Whoa! Did the tree fight back?" Tyler joked, but his smile faded when he saw my face. "There's something out there," I gasped, pointing back toward the woods. "Something with red eyes. It was watching me." Marcus laughed. "Man, how many beers did you have?" "I'm serious," I insisted, dropping back down by the fire, my eyes scanning the tree line. It had these glowing red eyes, and I heard it moving around me, sniffing. "Probably just a deer," Lucia said, but she sounded uncertain. Carla wrapped her arms around herself. "Or a coyote. There are coyotes out here, right?" "Coyotes don't have glowing red eyes," I said. Devon stood up, peering into the darkness beyond our campfire. "I don't see anything." That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that definitely didn't come from any coyote. It reverberated through the clearing, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We all froze, even Marcus, who'd been so quick to laugh at me. "What the hell was that?" Tyler whispered. "Shh," Carla hissed. We sat in silence, straining to hear. After a minute, Lucia pointed to our right. "Look!" 2 red pinpricks glowed in the darkness between the trees, about 60 yards from our campfire. Then to our left, another pair appeared, and behind us, 2 more. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered. "They're surrounding us," Devon said, his voice cracking. I counted at least 6 pairs of eyes, all the same height off the ground, all with that same unnatural red glow. The rustling sounds increased, accompanied by more of those deep, guttural growls. Tyler jumped to his feet. "Screw this! I'm not staying here to find out what those things are." Nobody argued. We scrambled to gather our stuff, abandoning the tent and most of our supplies. I kicked dirt over the fire, while Lucia and Carla grabbed the cooler. Devon snatched up his camera bag and Marcus's portable radio. We didn't speak, working with the frantic efficiency of genuine fear. The growling grew louder as we piled into the microbus. Marcus fumbled with the keys, swearing under his breath as the engine refused to turn over on the first try. "Hurry up!" Carla screamed from the back seat. "I'm trying!" Marcus shouted back, twisting the key again. Through the windshield, I saw 1 pair of red eyes move closer to the clearing. The creature was still hidden in shadow, but I could make out a massive silhouette, something big, moving on 2 legs. The engine finally sputtered to life. Marcus slammed the gear shift and the microbus lurched forward, headlights cutting through the darkness as we bounced along the crude dirt road that led back to the main highway. "Are they following us?" Lucia asked, her face pressed against the rear window. "I don't see anything," Devon answered, but his relief was premature. The microbus suddenly shuddered, as if we'd hit something. A heavy thud sounded on the roof. "What was that?" Carla shrieked. "Something hit us!" Tyler yelled. I twisted around in the passenger seat and looked through the rear window. My blood turned to ice. Running behind us on 2 legs was a creature I couldn't fully comprehend. The headlights of the microbus illuminated just enough for me to see a massive dog-like head, 3 or 4 times larger than any dog I'd ever seen, mounted on what appeared to be a humanoid body. Its front limbs were long, ending in what looked like clawed hands rather than paws. And it was gaining on us. "Drive faster!" I screamed at Marcus. "There's something chasing us!" Marcus floored the accelerator. The microbus shook violently as it hit 60 on the uneven dirt road. But the creature kept pace, those red eyes locked on us through the back window. Then it happened. The thing leaped forward with impossible speed and caught the rear of the vehicle. The bus lurched as clawed hands gripped the bumper. A howl unlike anything I'd ever heard, part wolf, part human scream, pierced through the night and through the thin metal walls of the microbus. "It's on us!" Devon shouted. "It's on the fucking van!" I felt the vehicle slow as the creature pulled backward. The engine whined as Marcus pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The microbus fishtailed wildly, throwing us against the sides. Lucia and Carla were screaming. Tyler had his arms over his head, as if bracing for the creature to tear through the roof. There was a horrible screeching sound of metal being torn, then a final jolt as we broke free. The microbus shot forward, and Marcus kept the pedal floored as we bounced and rattled down the dirt road. "Is it still there?" Marcus shouted, not daring to take his eyes off the road. I looked back and saw the creature standing in the middle of the path, those red eyes tracking us as we fled. It made no move to follow, but raised its massive head and let out another bone-chilling howl that seemed to echo across the entire forest. None of us spoke as Marcus navigated the winding roads that led out of land between the lakes. No one suggested stopping. No one mentioned turning around for our abandoned gear. The only sounds were the strain of the engine and Carla's occasional muffled sob from the back seat. We drove non-stop for almost an hour, finally reaching the familiar streets of Murray. Only when we pulled into the well-lit parking lot of our dorm did anyone speak. "What the hell was that thing?" Tyler asked, his voice hoarse. No one answered. We sat in silence for a moment, as if afraid that speaking about it might somehow summon it again. "We should check the van," Devon finally said. Make sure we're okay to drive it back to Marcus's place." We climbed out on shaky legs. The campus was quiet at this late hour, just a few lights burning in dorm windows. I felt a surge of relief at being surrounded by civilization again. Street lamps, buildings, sidewalks, the familiar trappings of human existence. Marcus walked around to the back of the microbus and stopped cold. "Holy shit!" We gathered behind him, staring in disbelief. The rear bumper was bent at an unnatural angle, and across the engine compartment cover were 4 deep gashes in the metal. Not dents, tears, as if something with immense strength had raked steel-cutting claws across the surface. "That's not possible," Lucia whispered. "Nothing could do that to metal." Devon reached out and touched one of the gashes. "These are real. Something did this." I felt sick looking at those marks, imagining the strength it would take to tear through steel like it was cardboard. Whatever had chased us wasn't just some large predator. It was something else entirely. "We need to report this," Carla said. "Call the police or the park rangers." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And tell them what? That we were attacked by some giant dogman in the woods? They'll breathalyze us and throw us in jail for the night." "Marcus is right," I said. "Who's going to believe this? We'd sound like a bunch of drunk college kids making up stories." Tyler took out his cigarettes with trembling hands. "I don't care if nobody believes us. I know what I saw." "We all saw it," Devon said quietly, "and we have proof." He gestured to the claw marks on the van. We debated what to do for a while, standing there in the parking lot. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, at least until morning when we could think more clearly. Marcus dropped each of us off at our dorms, and we agreed to meet for lunch the next day to discuss what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red orbs staring at me from the darkness. I heard that inhuman howl echoing in my ears. By morning, exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy blanket, but my memory of the events remained crystal clear. We met at the campus cafeteria at noon. Everyone looked as bad as I felt. Bloodshot eyes, pale faces. No one had slept well. "I've been thinking," Devon said after we'd gathered our food and found a quiet corner table. "What we saw last night matches some of the local legends around here." "What legends?" Lucia asked. "There are stories about LBL," Devon explained, "about a creature that's half man, half dog that roams the forests at night. They call it the Dogman, or sometimes the Beast of LBL." "That's just local folklore," Marcus said dismissively, but I noticed he wasn't eating his lunch. "Is it?" Devon countered. "Because what we saw last night sure as hell wasn't a bear or a coyote." "So you're saying we encountered some, what, werewolf?" Tyler asked. Devon shrugged. "I'm just saying there are stories, dating back decades. Native American legends, too, about skinwalkers and shapeshifters in these forests." "That doesn't help us figure out what to do now," Carla said. "Do we report this or not?" After more discussion, we decided to tell a simplified version to a park ranger, that we'd been camping and heard strange animal noises that scared us, and something had damaged Marcus's van as we were leaving. We wouldn't mention glowing red eyes or bipedal dog creatures. The ranger listened politely to our story, examined the claw marks on the microbus, and suggested we'd encountered a black bear that had been startled by our vehicle. He took down our information and thanked us for the report. I could tell from his condescending smile that he didn't believe a word of our sanitized story. In the weeks that followed, we tried to move on with our lives. Classes, exams, parties, the normal rhythm of college life resumed, but something had changed within each of us. We didn't talk about that night much, not even among ourselves. It was as if speaking about it made it more real, and none of us wanted that. Marcus sold his microbus a month later. He claimed it was because he needed the money, but I knew the real reason. None of us wanted to look at those claw marks anymore. We made an unspoken pact never to return to land between the lakes, especially the northern section where we'd camped. Whatever was out there, folklore monster or undiscovered predator, could stay there undisturbed. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear that howl echoing in my memory. I see those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness, and I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next group of college students who decide to spend a weekend camping in the wrong part of the forest. It's been almost 50 years since that night, and I've never told the full story to anyone outside our group. Devon became a wildlife photographer, Carla went into law, Tyler joined the military, Lucia became a doctor, Marcus started a construction company, and me, I became a history professor, specializing in American folklore. Some might call that ironic. We've stayed in touch over the decades, meeting every few years for reunions. We never camp, always hotels, always in cities. And we never talk about that night in 1973, even when we're alone together. Some experiences are better left buried, but sometimes I catch one of them looking toward the woods with a distant stare. And I know they're remembering too, remembering the red eyes, the inhuman howl, the creature that should not exist, but does. I still don't know what we encountered that night. I don't think I want to know. Some mysteries should remain unsolved, some corners of our world left unexplored, and some camping trips should never be repeated. Story 6. The chill hit me before the smell did. April nights in Kentucky get cold, especially out in land between the lakes. But that's not why I was shaking. 23 years on the force, 15 as Lyon County Sheriff, and I'd never seen anything like it. Never wanted to. My name's Jim Caldwell. I was responding to a call on that April night in '82 that changed everything I thought I knew about our world. The radio crackled just after 9 p.m. Dispatcher said a couple of hikers found something bad at one of the Upper Peninsula campgrounds. Real bad. They were so spooked they refused to go back to show us the site, just gave directions from a payphone in Grand Rivers and took off. Probably some damn kids pulling a prank, my deputy Hank grumbled as we bumped down the access road in the dark. Our headlights caught the reflective markers for Campsite 11, illuminating a small Starcraft pop-up camper. A dying campfire glowed nearby, embers still warm. Everything looked peaceful. I stepped out, flashlight sweeping the area. "Hello? Sheriff's Department?" No answer. The beam caught something near the picnic table. A dark mass. "Jesus Christ," Hank whispered behind me. My light revealed a man's body, or what was left of it. Both arms had been ripped clean off, tossed aside like broken branches. His head hung at an impossible angle, nearly detached, twisted backward. The flesh was shredded with deep gashes, not knife wounds. Something had torn into him with immense force. I recognized Robert Taylor immediately. He'd registered at the ranger station 2 days earlier, family man from Evansville, bringing the wife and kids for spring break camping. "Call it in," I told Hank, my voice steadier than I felt. "Get everyone out here." That's when I spotted the camper door. It hung partially open, bent outward with a massive dent. The metal was torn like paper, one hinge completely separated from the frame. Something had hit that door with incredible force. A small sneaker lay on the 3 metal steps leading inside. Kid-sized, blood smeared the aluminum. I forced myself to look down, finding a boy's body crumpled at the entrance. Michael Taylor, 11 years old. His face frozen in terror, deep parallel gashes across his chest and neck. He'd tried to get inside, to escape whatever was attacking his father. "Hank," I called, my voice breaking. "We got a kid." The smell hit me as I approached the camper door. Coppery blood, yes, but something else. Something raw and animal and wrong. I pulled my bandana over my nose and shined my light inside. Linda Taylor had fought hard, real hard. The walls of the camper were splashed with blood and marked with long, deep gouges. 4 parallel lines dragged through the paneling again and again. Her body lay across the small dinette table, torn open from sternum to pelvis. Contents that should never see daylight spilled across the laminate surface. Blood pooled and dripped onto the floor with steady, quiet taps. I backed out, gulping fresh air, when my light caught something in Linda's hand. She'd clutched at her attacker, torn away something dark and coarse. Fur. Not bear fur. Wrong texture, wrong color. I bagged it carefully. "Jim," Hank called from outside, voice tight. "There's supposed to be a little girl, Jessica, 9 years old." The girl. I'd almost forgotten. I swept my light across the campsite, stomach knotting. "Get on the radio. We need search teams, dogs, everybody." Within 30 minutes, the quiet campground transformed into a flood of emergency lights. Paramedics arrived first, then more deputies, state police, rangers, crime scene techs. The medical examiner bent over Robert Taylor's body, shaking his head. "This isn't an animal attack I've ever seen," he muttered. "Not a bear, not a cougar. These claw marks are spaced like a human hand, but the size—" He held his own hand up for comparison. The marks on Robert's chest were twice as wide. The search for Jessica expanded outward from the campsite in concentric circles. I joined Deputy Miller and Officer Rankin from State Police, pushing deeper into the woods. Our flashlight beams cut through darkness between the trees. The night had gone eerily quiet. No insects, no night birds. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Miller stopped suddenly. "You smell that?" The same putrid odor from the camper, but stronger. Rankin's light swept upward, searching the canopy. A drop hit my hat, then another. I reached up, fingers coming away wet and dark. "Oh, God," Miller whispered, his beam finding the source. Jessica Taylor hung suspended in the branches about 30 feet up, wedged into the fork of a huge oak. One arm dangled, hand nearly severed, swaying slightly. Large chunks of flesh had been torn from her torso and legs. Bite marks she'd been fed on. "She's been cached," Rankin said, voice professional but strained. "Like a mountain lion stores prey in a tree." "No mountain lion did this," I replied. "No cat drags a human 30 feet up a tree." We radioed the location. The fire department arrived with ladders and equipment to retrieve her body. I watched them work, unable to process what I was seeing. One of the firefighters vomited when they got her down. Can't blame him. I nearly did the same. By midnight, we had the scene somewhat contained. 4 bodies. A family obliterated. The coroner documented wounds while crime scene techs photographed everything. I bagged the fur sample from Linda's hand myself, labeling it carefully. Strange claw marks, tremendous strength, bodies partially consumed. My mind cycled through possibilities: escaped zoo animal, rabid bear, deranged human killer using some kind of weapon. Nothing fit. Dawn was approaching when the convoy arrived. 3 unmarked black SUVs and 2 military trucks from Fort Campbell rolled into the campground. Men in dark uniforms and others in suits emerged, speaking in clipped, efficient sentences. One approached me directly. Tall, crew-cut, eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the darkness. "Sheriff Caldwell? I'm Agent Wilson, Department of Interior. We're taking over this investigation." I stood my ground. "This is my jurisdiction. These people died in my county." "Not anymore." He handed me a document with federal letterhead. "National security matter. Your team is instructed to establish a perimeter 1 mile out and maintain it. No one enters, no statements to press." "What the hell are you talking about? A family was slaughtered here." Wilson removed his sunglasses, revealing cold eyes. "Sheriff, this isn't a request. Your cooperation is appreciated but not required. We have authorization to remove you forcibly if necessary." I looked around. More men were emerging from the vehicles, some carrying automatic weapons. Military, not just agents. Whatever was happening went beyond normal protocol. "My crime scene techs collected evidence," I said. "Samples, photos. All materials will be surrendered immediately." Wilson's tone left no room for argument. Any copies, notes, or personal observations about this scene are now classified. Sharing them will constitute a federal offense. They systematically collected everything: bags, cameras, samples, even the fur I'd found clutched in Linda Taylor's hand. Soldiers established a perimeter while men in hazmat suits entered the camper. The bodies were placed in specialized containers, not regular body bags. I gathered my deputies, explaining the situation. None of us liked it, but the federal presence gave us little choice. We established the requested perimeter and watched from a distance as they dismantled the entire crime scene. Later that morning, around 10 a.m., we heard it. A burst of automatic weapons fire from deep within the park, maybe 2 miles from the campsite. Then another. Several minutes of silence followed, then sustained fire. Whatever they were shooting at, it wasn't going down easily. By afternoon, the feds were packing up. I approached Wilson as his team loaded the last equipment into trucks. "What killed that family?" I demanded. He paused, considering me. "Nothing killed that family, Sheriff. There was a terrible accident. Gas leak in their camper, tragic." "Bullshit, I saw the bodies." "No, you didn't." Wilson stepped closer. "You responded to a call about a possible gas leak. By the time you arrived, federal authorities had already secured the scene due to hazardous materials concerns. You established a perimeter as requested and left. That's all." I held his gaze. "People know about this. My deputies, paramedics, fire department. They'll receive the same instructions. It would be unfortunate if rumors spread about something that never happened." 2 days later, I got a call from Dale Kirby, a Department of Natural Resources officer I'd known for 15 years. He asked to meet privately at the boat ramp on the far side of the lake. I found him sitting in his truck, looking like he hadn't slept. "Jim," he said when I climbed in, "I saw something yesterday I can't make sense of." He explained that after the gunfire, he'd used his position to get close to a fire access road deep in the park. He watched as military personnel struggled to load something onto one of their trucks, something massive. "It had fur, dark brown or black," Dale whispered. "But the head, Jim, it was like a dog's head, but wrong. Too big. And the body," he swallowed hard, "it had arms, like a man's arms, but with these claws. Had to be 2 inches long." "You sure about this?" "They were wearing masks because of the smell. God, the smell was like nothing I've ever... It was like death and something else. Something rotten and wild." Dale looked at me directly. "They tracked it to a cave system. That's where all the shooting happened." I never filed an official report on the Taylor family murders. Couldn't. Any paperwork mysteriously disappeared. The campsite was completely renovated that summer. New fire pit, new picnic table, even fresh gravel. The ranger station had no record of the Taylors ever registering, but I kept my own records. Private notes in a lockbox at my home, and I kept asking questions, quiet ones, to the right people. 6 months later, I received an unmarked package. Inside was a lab report on the fur sample I'd collected from Linda Taylor's hand. DNA analysis showed something impossible, an unknown hominid species with canine genetic markers, not a known animal, not fully human either. That night, 2 men broke into my house while I was on shift. Nothing was taken except my lockbox. The message was clear. I retired 3 years later, couldn't do the job anymore, not with what I knew. The land between the lakes has a history most folks don't know about. Stories going back to the early settlers about things in those woods, things that walk on 2 legs sometimes, 4 legs others, things that hunt families. I still live in Lyon County. I still avoid those woods after dark. And I still remember the faces of the Taylor family, though official records say they never existed at all. The case remains open in my mind, the evidence collected and hidden away by men who seemed prepared, like they'd done this before, like they knew what they were looking for. And sometimes, on spring nights when the air gets cold, I wonder if they got them all, or if somewhere deep in those woods, something is still waiting, watching, hungry. I tell you to go see for yourself, but I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Some things once seen can't be unseen. Some knowledge can't be unlearned. And some monsters are real. Story 7. I've been waiting 60 years to tell this story properly. Until now, it's just been scraps of recollection, bits and pieces I've offered to sympathetic ears, who usually end up looking at me like I should be medicated. But what I saw that summer day in 1963 was real. I know it was real because I can still see those eyes when I close mine at night. My name is Jacob Bennett. I was 13 years old when my parents decided we should spend 2 weeks in Acadia, Maine for our summer vacation. Dad had gotten a promotion at the insurance office back in Oak Ridge, and Mom thought we deserved something nicer than our usual camping trip to Lake Millwood. They rented a small cottage near the coast, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with worn furniture and the perpetual smell of salt and mildew. But to me, it was paradise. I spent most mornings exploring while my parents slept in. They'd stay up late playing cards and drinking with the neighbors, so I had a good 3 hours to myself each day. The cottage was about a quarter-mile from an estuary where fresh water met the sea. It fascinated me, the way the water levels changed with the tides, how the vegetation shifted from woodland to marsh plants, the small crabs and minnows darting away from my footsteps. On July 17th, I woke early. The house was silent, except for Dad snoring from the main bedroom. I pulled on my shorts and t-shirt, laced up my PF flyers, and grabbed a peanut butter sandwich Mum had made the night before. The screen door squeaked as I slipped out, but nobody stirred. The morning air felt cool against my skin. Dew soaked through my sneakers as I cut across the grassy field behind our cottage. Birds were already busy in the trees, and somewhere in the distance I heard a dog barking. The path to the estuary was well worn from my daily trips. 15 minutes of walking through scraggly pines and over exposed roots brought me to where the land began to slope downward toward the water. The tide was coming in. I could tell from the way the current in the creek had reversed, pushing inland instead of out to sea. The water level was higher than yesterday, covering the rocks where I'd seen a cluster of periwinkles. That's when I decided to climb the sandy bank on the eastern side of the estuary. It rose about 20 feet above the water and would give me a better view of the incoming tide. My fingers dug into the loose sand as I scrambled up. Roots from the scrub pines provided handholds where the incline steepened. At the top, I brushed the sand from my palms and stood to survey my kingdom. The estuary stretched before me, curving around a bend about 50 yards ahead. The water moved steadily inward, carrying small branches and clumps of seaweed. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought someone had fallen into the water. A body was floating on its back, moving with the incoming tide. I dropped to my stomach and inched forward to the edge of the bank for a better look. The figure was about 12 to 15 feet away from me, drifting parallel to my position. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The creature had the general shape of a man, but was covered in greyish-white hair that floated around it in the water. The hair was long, maybe 6 to 8 inches, and moved with the current like seaweed. It reminded me of the golden retriever that lived next door back home, same texture, but completely wrong color. Its face was the most disturbing part. While the body was covered in that pale fur, the face was bare, hairless pink-red skin with deep wrinkles and lines. It looked weathered, like the faces of the old fishermen who sat outside the general store in town, but older somehow. Ancient. Most of its body remained underwater. I could make out the knees slightly bent beneath the surface. Its arms floated at its sides, relaxed, as if it were taking a casual bath rather than drifting with the tide. I estimated it to be about 6 feet long, smaller than my dad, who stood 6'3". The creature moved at the same speed as the incoming tide, about 4 miles per hour. It made no attempt to swim or direct itself, just floating, passive, face above the waterline. Then it turned its head. Our eyes met, and everything around me seemed to stop. Its eyes were grayish-blue, clear and alert. Not the eyes of something drifting mindlessly, not the eyes of an animal. They were aware, intelligent, studying me as intently as I studied it. The strangest feeling washed over me. Instead of fear, I felt calm, peaceful, like I was exactly where I needed to be at that moment. We held that gaze for several seconds, though it felt much longer. Then, without any change in expression, the creature let the current carry it around the bend in the estuary, and it disappeared from view. I stayed frozen at the edge of that bank for several minutes, expecting it to return, or for someone to shout that they'd seen it too. But there was only the sound of water lapping against the shore and birds calling overhead. I scrambled down the bank and ran home, my heart pounding against my ribs. I burst through the door of the cottage, finding Mom at the kitchen table with her coffee and cigarette. "Jacob Alexander Bennett, don't you slam that door," she snapped, tapping ash into a small tray shaped like a lighthouse. "Mom, I saw something in the water." The words tumbled out. It was like a man, but covered in white hair, except for its face, and it looked at me, and Dad appeared in the doorway to their bedroom, his hair sticking up on one side. "What's all the commotion?" "Jacob says he saw something in the estuary," Mum said, her voice carrying that tone parents use when they're humoring a child. I described what I'd seen in detail, the hair, the wrinkled face, the bent knees beneath the surface, those eyes that seemed to look straight through me. Dad scratched his stubbled chin. "Sounds like you saw a seal, son, or maybe a walrus that drifted down from the north." "It wasn't a seal. It had a face like a person and long white hair all over its body." Mom exchanged a look with Dad. "Honey, the mind plays tricks sometimes, especially when you're looking at things in the water. Remember last summer when you thought you saw a shark in Lake Millwood and it turned out to be a tire? This was different. I was close to it, just a few feet away." Dad put his hand on my shoulder. "Tell you what, after breakfast, we'll walk down there together and have a look around. Maybe we'll find your sea creature." But we never did go look. After breakfast, the Thompsons from the cottage down the road invited my parents to join them for a day trip to Bar Harbor. My sighting was forgotten in the excitement of souvenir shopping and seafood lunch. I returned to the estuary every morning for the rest of our vacation, climbing that same sandy bank and watching the water for hours. The creature never reappeared. By the time we packed to go home, I'd nearly convinced myself that my parents were right. Maybe it had been a seal or some other marine animal that my imagination had transformed. Years passed. I graduated high school, went to state college, got a job at the same insurance company as my father. I married my high school girlfriend, Linda, and we had 2 kids. The memory of that day in Acadia faded like an old photograph, tucked away in the back drawer of my mind. Until 1975, when the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek came to our local theater. Linda wanted to see it because she'd heard it was scary, and I agreed without giving it much thought. But sitting in that dark theater, watching the reenactments of Bigfoot sightings, something stirred in my memory. The creatures in the film were different from what I'd seen, dark-haired, ape-like, aggressive. But the concept of an unknown, hair-covered being lurking in remote areas brought that summer morning rushing back to me. I remembered those eyes, that peaceful feeling, the way its hair had floated around it in the water. "You okay?" Linda whispered, squeezing my hand. "You're squeezing the popcorn to death." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, back on that sandy bank in Maine. After the movie, I started reading everything I could find about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and similar creatures. Most accounts described large, dark-haired beings that walked upright through forests. Nothing matched what I'd seen, a medium-sized, greyish-white-haired creature floating peacefully in an estuary. I even called the local university and spoke to a biology professor about the possibility of unknown primates in North America. He laughed politely and suggested I'd seen a bear with mange or possibly a human diver in a wetsuit. I didn't mention the eye contact or the strange calm I'd felt. Life moved on. The kids grew up. Linda and I bought a bigger house. My parents passed away, Dad from a heart attack in '89, Mom from cancer 3 years later. Without them around to remind me of that summer in Acadia, the memory became less tangible, more like a dream I'd once had. Then in 2001, I found an online forum for people who claimed to have encountered unexplained creatures. Sitting at my desktop computer in the spare bedroom that had become my office after retirement, I scrolled through dozens of stories. Most seemed exaggerated or outright fabricated, tales of 10-foot monsters throwing trees and howling at the moon. But one post caught my eye. A fisherman from Washington State described seeing what he called an old Sasquatch swimming in Puget Sound. He wrote about its pale coloration, which he attributed to age, and how it seemed comfortable in the water. He mentioned making eye contact and feeling strangely at peace. My hands shook as I typed my first post to the forum, describing what I'd seen nearly 40 years earlier. I included every detail I could remember: the wrinkled face, the golden retriever-like hair, the bent knees beneath the surface, the greyish-blue eyes. The responses came quickly. Some suggested I'd seen a corpse or a drowning victim. Others proposed various animals: seals, sea lions, even polar bears, though none of these explanations accounted for the humanoid face or the deliberate eye contact. A few people took me seriously. They shared similar stories or theories about aquatic adaptations in unknown hominids. One user suggested I might have encountered an elderly member of a Bigfoot-type species, pointing out that the greyish-white coloration could indicate advanced age, similar to how human hair greys. For the first time in decades, I felt understood. These strangers on the internet believed me, or at least considered my experience worthy of serious discussion. I found myself checking the forum daily, engaging in conversations about taxonomy and habitat ranges for creatures science didn't acknowledge existed. Linda noticed the change in me. "You're obsessed with that computer lately," she said one evening, as I declined her invitation to watch our favorite TV show. "What's so interesting?" I hesitated before answering. In our 40 years of marriage, I'd never told her about what I saw that day. It had always seemed too bizarre, too likely to make her question my sanity. "I'm talking to some people about something I saw when I was a kid," I said carefully. "Something strange." She sat beside me, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "What kind of strange?" So I told her everything: the estuary, the creature, the eyes, the peaceful feeling. I described how my parents had dismissed it and how I'd eventually convinced myself they were right. I showed her the forum and the responses to my post. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she took my hand in hers. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this before?" "I thought you'd think I was crazy." She smiled. "Jacob Bennett, after 40 years together, don't you think I already know all your crazy parts and love you anyway?" That night, we stayed up late looking at websites about cryptid sightings and theories. Linda, ever practical, made a spreadsheet of similar encounters reported in coastal areas, organizing them by date and location. She found patterns I hadn't noticed: a cluster of sightings in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s, another along the Gulf Coast in the early 1990s. In 2014, Linda passed away. Heart failure, quick and unexpected. The house felt emptier than I could have imagined. I stopped checking the forums and websites. What was the point without her there to discuss theories with me? But last year, my granddaughter Katie came to stay for the summer while her parents traveled for work. She was 13, the same age I'd been during that summer in Acadia. One evening, she came downstairs after using my computer. Grandpa, why do you have all these bookmarks about Bigfoot? I looked up from my crossword puzzle. Just an old man's hobby. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. Did you see one or something? The directness of youth. I studied her face. Linda's eyes, my son's chin. Not exactly a Bigfoot, but something different. Tell me, she said, leaning forward. So I did. The whole story, unfiltered. When I finished, she didn't laugh or roll her eyes like I expected. Instead, she asked questions, thoughtful ones about the creature's movements, its apparent comfort in water, the color of its hair. Have you ever gone back? She asked. To Acadia, I mean. I shook my head. Never seemed the right time. 2 weeks later, Katie had convinced her parents, and we were making the long drive to Maine. The cottage we rented wasn't the same one from 1963 that had been torn down decades ago to make way for larger vacation homes, but it was in the same area, just a quarter-mile from that estuary. The land had changed. More houses, fewer trees. The path I'd taken as a boy was now marked with private property signs, forcing us to approach the estuary from a different direction. But the sandy bank was still there, eroded somewhat by 60 years of tides and storms, but recognizable. Katie and I climbed it together one morning at high tide. This is where you were? She asked, lying on her stomach at the edge, as I had done so many years ago. Right here. I eased down beside her, my old knees protesting. The creature was floating right about there. I pointed to the water below us. We watched in silence as the tide pushed the water inland. No mysterious beings appeared, just water, a few birds, the occasional fish jumping. Do you think it's still out there somewhere? Katie asked after a while. Or maybe it's children or grandchildren? I considered this. I don't know. Maybe. The ocean's a big place and we still haven't explored all of it. There could be all kinds of things living in remote areas that we haven't documented. She nodded thoughtfully. Whatever it was, it picked you to show itself to. That means something. I looked at my granddaughter, this smart, curious girl who accepted my impossible story without question. You know, your grandmother said something similar. She thought maybe it wasn't random, that there was a reason it made eye contact with me specifically. What do you think the reason was? I watched the water flowing past, remembering those grayish-blue eyes and the strange peace they brought me. I think some experiences aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be remembered. We stayed until the tide began to recede. As we walked back to the cottage, Katie slipped her hand into mine. I believe you saw something real, Grandpa, something special. For the first time in 60 years, I felt completely at peace with my memory of that day. Whether it was a Bigfoot, some unknown aquatic mammal, or something else entirely, I had seen it. It had seen me. And now, finally, I had been able to share that experience with someone who truly understood its significance. That's enough for me. Story 8. The air hung heavy that July night in '67. Rain spattered across the dark water of the strip mine pit, creating tiny ripples that glinted in our flashlight beams. My hands were slick with a mixture of sweat, rain, and fish slime as I rebaited my hook for what felt like the 100th time. The baits weren't biting, but none of us were ready to call it quits. Not yet. This is the worst damn fishing trip we've had all summer, grumbled Dale, flicking his cigarette into the water with a hiss. I've caught exactly jack and shit. Weather's against us, I replied, casting my line back out. The lead weight made a soft plunk as it broke the surface. Beside me, Lyle nodded, his face ghostly in the beam of his flashlight as he rummaged through our cooler. Storm front moving in. Fish can sense it. They're staying deep tonight. The three of us had been friends since grade school. Now, at 19, we'd spent countless nights fishing this abandoned strip mine outside Farmington. The owners didn't much care about trespassers as long as we didn't cause trouble. The pit was our secret spot, usually good for a stringer full of bass. Not tonight, though. Rain pattered against my hat brim as I checked my watch. 10:45 p.m. We'd been at it since sundown, with nothing to show except some bait fish and one sad-looking crappie Lyle had tossed back. I was about to suggest we pack it in when Dale suddenly sat up straight. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened. At first, I heard nothing beyond the gentle patter of rain and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. "Hear what?" Lyle asked, but then his expression changed. "Wait." Then I caught it too, a faint, low hum. The sound reminded me of a distant motorcycle or a large insect, but something wasn't right about it. It seemed to be coming from the gravel access road that ran past the north end of the lake. "Probably just a truck," I said, though I didn't believe it. The pitch was wrong, too steady. "Nah, listen," Dale insisted. "That ain't no truck." The humming grew louder, deeper, a resonant drone that seemed to vibrate in my chest. As it intensified, I noticed something else. The night had gone completely silent. No frogs, no crickets, nothing but that steady, approaching drone. "What the hell is that?" Lyle whispered, setting down his beer. Before either of us could respond, a tremendous splash erupted from the slough adjacent to the main pit, a marshy area about 50 yards to our right. The splash was followed by violent thrashing sounds, like something massive struggling through water. "Jesus Christ!" Dale hissed, grabbing his flashlight and pointing it toward the noise. The beam caught nothing but rippling water and the tall reeds that lined the bank. The thrashing continued, moving closer to shore. We could hear it pushing through the water, then the sound changed. Whatever it was had reached the bank and was now moving through the reeds, which stood a good 8 feet tall. The three of us froze. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, my mouth gone dry. The creature continued crashing through the vegetation, heading in our direction. "Should we run?" Lyle whispered, his voice cracking. I shook my head. "Let's just stay put. Probably a deer." "That ain't no goddamn deer," Dale muttered. Curiosity overcame my fear. I stood slowly, grabbing my flashlight. "I'm gonna check it out." "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Lyle grabbed my arm, but I shook him off. "Just stay here. I'll be right back." I moved cautiously toward the sounds, my rubber boots squishing in the mud. A narrow footpath circled the lake, cutting through the reeds at intervals. I reached one of these openings and stopped. The thrashing had ceased. Whatever was there had gone still. I peered down the path into the darkness. The rain had let up momentarily, and a sliver of moonlight broke through the clouds. That's when I saw it, a large, dark mass standing motionless about 10 feet away. It towered over me, at least 7 feet tall, visible through gaps in the reeds. I couldn't make out any details in the darkness, just its massive silhouette. My blood turned to ice. I stood paralyzed, unable to move or breathe. The thing shifted slightly. I heard a wet, sucking sound as it moved, like boots being pulled from deep mud. The droning noise started again, softer now, coming directly from the entity. My paralysis broke. Terror flooded through me, and I turned and ran, not toward my friends, but toward the faint lights of a farmhouse visible on the far side of the lake. It was the only sign of civilization I could see. "Help!" I screamed as I ran. "Somebody help us!" I heard shouts behind me, Dale and Lyle, their voices pitched high with panic. Later they told me they thought I'd abandoned them. They saw the creature move toward our fishing spot after I fled, and in desperation they jumped into the water, splashing toward the center of the pit. I reached the access road and pounded down it toward the farmhouse, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. The rain started again, heavier now. I slipped in the mud, crashed to my knees and scrambled back up. The farmhouse seemed no closer. After running what felt like a mile, I realized I was heading in the wrong direction. The house was farther around the lake than I'd thought. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked back. I couldn't leave my friends. Whatever that thing was, they were facing it alone. I turned and ran back, my chest burning, rain pelting my face. When I neared our fishing spot, I slowed and approached cautiously. Our gear lay scattered where we'd left it, no sign of Dale or Lyle. "Guys?" I called in a harsh whisper. "Over here," came Lyle's voice, barely audible. "Under the boat." At the water's edge, I saw an overturned aluminum rowboat that had been abandoned there months ago. I crept toward it and found Dale and Lyle huddled underneath, their clothes soaked, eyes wild with fear. "Get in here, you idiot!" Dale hissed, grabbing my shirt and yanking me under. "Where is it?" I whispered, my heart still racing. "It went back into the reeds," Lyle said, his teeth chattering, "but it's still out there. We can hear it moving." As if on cue, we heard heavy footsteps in the mud, maybe 20 feet away. The sound of something large moving through shallow water followed. Then that drone again, louder, more insistent. "What did you see?" Dale asked, clutching a fishing knife in his trembling hand. "Just a shape," I whispered. "Big, really big." "We need to make a run for it," Lyle suggested. Dale shook his head fiercely. "No way! That thing's between us and the road. We're staying put till daylight." I couldn't argue with that logic. The boat provided meager shelter, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, listening to the creature as it patrolled the shoreline. For the next 5 hours, we remained hidden, shivering with cold and fear. The entity never strayed far. We could track its movements by the sounds it made, the splashing as it waded through the water, the heavy footfalls when it moved on land, and that horrible droning that rose and fell like some unearthly language. "If it lifts this boat," Dale whispered at one point, brandishing the knife, "I'm going for its eyes." I nodded, though I doubted the small blade would do much against whatever stalked us. Around 3 a.m., the rain finally stopped. The clouds cleared enough for moonlight to illuminate the area. The creature had been quiet for several minutes, and I cautiously peeked from beneath the boat. I saw it immediately, a massive silhouette standing knee-deep in the water about 50 yards away. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a broad torso and long, powerful limbs. Its head seemed oddly shaped, too large for its body. As I watched, it turned slowly in our direction. I ducked back under the boat, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. "It's looking this way," I whispered. We fell silent, barely daring to breathe. Heavy splashing approached. Something large moved through the water, coming directly toward our hiding place. The drone grew louder, vibrating through the aluminum above us. It stopped just yards from the overturned boat. We could hear it breathing, deep, wet inhalations that didn't sound human or like any animal I knew. Water dripped rhythmically as it stood motionless. Dale gripped the knife so hard his knuckles turned white. Lyle had his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving in silent prayer. I stared at the edge of the boat, expecting at any moment to see it lifted away, exposing us to whatever horror waited outside. Minutes passed, the breathing continued. Then slowly, the splashing resumed as the creature moved away. For the remaining hours until dawn, it followed the same pattern, approaching our hiding place, standing near us for heart-stopping minutes, then moving away to patrol other areas of the shoreline. It seemed to be hunting us, knowing we were there but unable to pinpoint our location. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the clouds, the sounds changed. The splashing grew distant. The drone faded. We heard heavy footsteps on the gravel road, moving away from the lake. We waited another 30 minutes before Dale finally spoke. "I think it's gone." Cautiously, we emerged from beneath the boat. My legs were numb, my clothes soaked and muddy. The lakeside looked eerily normal in the pale morning light, just an abandoned strip mine with our fishing gear scattered around. "Look at this," Lyle called, standing at the water's edge. We joined him, staring at the ground. The mud along the shoreline was marked with indentations, footprints, if you could call them that. They were huge, at least 15 inches long, with what looked like 3 broad toes or pads. They sank deep into the mud, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. "That ain't human," Dale whispered. "And it ain't no bear either." We followed the tracks along the shore. They led to the gravel road, where they became harder to distinguish, but still visible as disturbances in the gravel. They headed northwest, toward the dense woods that bordered Farmington. None of us suggested following them. We gathered our equipment in silence, too exhausted and shaken for conversation. Our fishing rods seemed absurdly normal after what we'd experienced. "We don't tell nobody about this," Dale finally said as we loaded my truck. "They'll think we're crazy or drunk." Lyle nodded. "Ain't nobody gonna believe us anyway." I wasn't so sure about keeping quiet, but I agreed nonetheless. We drove back to Farmington in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. That night changed us. We never went night fishing at the strip mine again. In fact, we never went there at all. When other locals mentioned good base fishing at the pit, we found excuses not to join them. 2 weeks after our encounter, a farmer 5 miles northwest of the lake reported something had killed 3 of his cattle. They were found partially submerged in his pond, their chest cavities torn open. The local paper blamed it on a bear, though no one could remember the last confirmed bear sighting in the area. That winter, Dale moved to Chicago. Lyle joined the army the following spring. I stayed in Farmington, taking over my father's hardware store, but I never ventured into the woods alone again. Sometimes, on humid summer nights, when the air feels heavy with approaching rain, I find myself listening for that drone. I keep my windows closed, no matter how hot it gets. I tell myself it was just some animal, maybe a bear that had wandered far from its usual territory. But deep down, I know better. Whatever stalked us that night by the strip mine pit wasn't anything natural. It moved with purpose, hunting us methodically through the darkness. It wasn't just a predator seeking food. It was something else entirely. Something big, powerful, and unknown that deliberately terrorized us for hours. I've never heard that drone again, but I know it's out there, somewhere in the dark woods around Farmington. Waiting, watching, and sometimes, when the night is at its blackest, I swear I can feel it listening for me too. Story 9. Adil. I jolted awake in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no reason I could name. The clock on my bedside table read 2:17 a.m. My roommate Billy snored softly in the bunk below, completely dead to the world. The cabin felt unnaturally quiet aside from that steady rhythm of sleep and the occasional creak of the old wooden structure. Something had woken me. I lay still, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe a nightmare I couldn't remember. Maybe one of the senior cadets playing a prank. Summer school at St. John's Military Academy in Delafield wasn't exactly fun, but we made do. I rolled over, facing the window. The thin curtains didn't fully cover the glass, leaving a gap where moonlight and the harsh glow from the central light pole filtered through. That's when I saw it. Under the bright lamp that illuminated our central water fountain stood something. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, it was still there. The creature was massive. It stood on 2 legs beside the fountain, which only came up to its knees. The water fountain wasn't small. It stood about 3 feet tall. This thing towered over it, at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The creature bent down awkwardly, its massive frame hunching to reach the fountain. It didn't drink normally. Instead, it filled its mouth with water, then tilted its head back and sprayed the water into the air. It repeated this bizarre ritual several times, the water catching the light as it arced through the night air. When it finished, it straightened up. Even from my window, I could make out broad shoulders, long arms that hung almost to its knees, and a somewhat conical head that sat directly on those shoulders with barely any neck visible. I should have ducked down. I should have hidden. Instead, I watched, paralyzed, as the creature turned and began walking toward the first cabin in our semicircle. Our cabins were arranged in a neat half-moon, 20 in total, facing the central area with the fountain and light pole. I was in cabin 12. The creature approached cabin 1 with purposeful strides. It reached the door, and then, to my absolute horror, it ducked down and entered. Just walked right in, folding its massive frame to fit through the standard-sized doorway. It disappeared inside for just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, then emerged and moved directly to cabin 2. My mind raced. Were the boys inside awake? Did they see it? Was it hurting them? But there were no screams, no sounds of struggle, just the methodical movement of this massive, hairy thing as it visited each cabin in sequence. 3, 4, 5. It continued its inspection, never spending more than a couple seconds inside each cabin before moving to the next. I couldn't move, couldn't call out, couldn't do anything but watch as the creature made its way steadily through the semicircle, edging closer to my cabin with each stop. 6, 7, 8. My mind screamed at my body to do something. Hide under the bed, wake Billy, run! But I remained frozen at the window, watching the nightmarish inspection continue. 9, 10, 11. It was at the cabin next door now. The windows rattled slightly as the heavy creature entered. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, so loud I was certain it would wake Billy. But he slept on, oblivious to the horror that was about to reach our door. Then the night split open with sound. A high, piercing scream erupted from cabin 11, a boy's voice, raw with terror. It echoed across the grounds, bouncing off the surrounding trees. The creature burst back out of the cabin, its movement suddenly frantic. It turned away from our cabin and sprinted. God, it moved fast for something so big, toward the woods behind the semicircle. Its powerful legs carried it in bounding strides that ate up the distance. It crashed through the underbrush at the forest's edge, snapping branches and crushing foliage under its weight. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness of the trees. Lights flicked on in cabins all around the semicircle. Billy stirred beneath me. "What the hell was that?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I had just watched a Bigfoot, there was no other word for it, methodically inspect our cabins before fleeing into the night. "Thomas, you awake?" Billy asked, more alert now. "Yeah," I managed to croak. Someone screamed. By now, doors were opening. Cadets in various states of undress spilled out, looking around in confusion. A commotion centered around cabin 11. I pulled on my boots and followed Billy outside. Sergeant Miller, one of the summer instructors, pushed through the gathering crowd. "Back to your cabins, all of you," he barked. "Now!" But we could all see into cabin 11, where a boy named Eric Thompson sat on his bed, knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth. His face was drained of color, his eyes wide and unfocused. His roommate stood awkwardly beside him, clearly unsure what to do. "I saw it," Eric kept repeating. "It was right there looking at me." Sergeant Miller knelt beside Eric's bed. "What did you see, son?" he asked, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. Eric just shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't human," he whispered. "It wasn't human." Miller looked up at the rest of us, still gathered in the doorway despite his orders. "I said back to your cabins, now, or it's 5 miles at dawn for the lot of you." We scattered, returning to our bunks. But sleep was impossible. I lay awake until sunrise, replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind. The massive, hair-covered body, the strange way it drank from the fountain, the methodical inspection of our cabins, the incredible speed with which it fled when Eric screamed. At breakfast, the rumors flew. Eric had seen a bear, a homeless man, a senior cadet in a costume. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't any of those things. It was something that shouldn't exist. Something from campfire stories and tabloid headlines. A Bigfoot. Eric didn't come to breakfast. Word spread that his father had been called. By lunchtime, Eric's belongings were packed and a black sedan waited in the parking lot. I watched from the mess hall window as Mr. Thompson loaded his son's duffel bag into the trunk. Eric climbed into the passenger seat, still pale, still moving like someone in a trance. They drove away, gravel crunching under the tires. "Good riddance," said Danny Maxwell at my table. "What a baby, screaming about shadows in the night." The others laughed. I didn't. I pushed my food around my plate, my appetite gone. After lunch, Sergeant Miller assembled us on the parade ground. "Last night, one of your fellow cadets experienced what we believe was a night terror," he announced, his voice carrying across the open space. "For those of you unfamiliar, night terrors can cause extremely realistic hallucinations and intense fear. Cadet Thompson has returned home to recover." He paused, his gaze sweeping across our ranks. "I expect there will be no further discussion of this matter, no wild stories, no rumors. Is that clear?" "Yes, Sergeant," we responded in unison. But his explanation didn't match what I'd seen. Night terrors didn't explain the massive creature I'd watched with my own eyes. That night I lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling. Billy's breathing had evened out hours ago, but sleep eluded me. Every small sound, the creak of the cabin settling, the hoot of an owl in the distant woods, sent my heart racing. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, like they thought Eric was crazy. Or worse, they'd think I was making it up for attention. The next day, Sergeant Miller announced that the woods behind the cabins were off-limits until further notice. A ranger had reported bear activity in the area, he said. For our safety, we were to stay in the cleared areas of the academy grounds. I knew there was no bear. 3 days after the incident, I found myself alone with Kevin Peters, Eric's roommate, during a fire drill. The rest of our squad had already assembled at the meeting point, but Kevin had gone back for his jacket, and I was sent to hurry him along. "You saw something that night, didn't you?" Kevin asked suddenly as we walked back toward the assembly area. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" Kevin glanced around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "The night Eric, when he screamed, you saw something, I can tell." "What did Eric see?" I countered, avoiding a direct answer. Kevin's face went pale. He wouldn't really talk about it, just kept saying it wasn't human over and over. Said it came into our cabin and looked at him. Just stood there and looked at him for a second. He said its eyes reflected the light from outside, like an animal's. I swallowed hard. "Did he say what it looked like?" "Big, hairy, walked on 2 legs. Kevin shook his head. "Sounds crazy, right? Like something out of a monster movie." "Yeah," I agreed weakly. "Crazy." We reached the assembly area, and Sergeant Miller gave us both demerits for being late. I barely noticed. My mind was racing with the confirmation that Eric had seen the same thing I had. The summer session continued. Days passed, then weeks. The incident faded from conversation, replaced by the usual topics. Who got letters from home, who was excelling at drills, who got caught with contraband candy bars. But I didn't forget. I started sleeping with my back to the wall, facing the window. I listened for unusual sounds in the night. I watched the woods during our outdoor activities, half expecting to see a massive shape moving among the trees. But the creature never returned. At least, not that I saw. As the summer session drew to a close, my father arrived to drive me home. As we pulled away from St. John's, the semicircle of cabins growing smaller in the rearview mirror, he asked the usual questions. Had I learned a lot? Had I made friends? Had I enjoyed the experience? I answered automatically, not really paying attention to my own words. My mind was on that night, on what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to tell him, to unburden myself of this secret that felt so heavy, but another part knew he wouldn't believe me. No one would. "Everything okay, Thomas?" my father asked, glancing over at me. You seem distracted." "Just tired," I lied, ready to be home. He nodded, accepting this simple explanation. We drove on in silence for a while. "You know," he said eventually, "these woods have a lot of history. Native American tribes lived here for thousands of years before European settlers arrived." I looked out at the dense forest lining the highway. "What kind of history?" "All kinds. Battles, celebrations, legends." He shrugged. "Some pretty strange stories, too. Old man Peterson told me once that his grandfather swore he encountered a wild man in these woods back in the 1890s. 8 feet tall, covered in hair, moved faster than any human could. My blood ran cold." "What did you say?" "Just local folklore," my father chuckled. "Every rural area has stories like that. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, wild men of the woods, makes for good campfire tales." I turned back to the window, watching the trees blur past. It wasn't just a campfire tale. I had seen it with my own eyes. It had methodically inspected our cabins for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. It had fled when discovered, disappearing into these very woods. That summer at St. John's Military Academy changed me. Not because of the discipline or the education, but because I learned that the world contained things that defied explanation, things that hid in the shadows of forests and prowled in the dead of night, things that most people dismissed as legends or lies. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not until now, more than 60 years later. I've lived a full life, raised a family, built a career. I've traveled and seen wonders both natural and man-made, but nothing has ever erased the memory of that massive, hair-covered figure bending awkwardly to drink from a water fountain, then methodically moving from cabin to cabin in the middle of the night. Sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas with dense forests, I find myself scanning the tree line. Just in case. Just in case I might catch another glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that, for whatever unknowable reason, once decided to conduct a midnight inspection of the sleeping cadets at St. John's Military Academy in the summer of 1961. Story 10. I still see its face in my dreams. The wide mouth, those fluttering eyelids, human-like fingers twitching in the blood-stained snow. What we did that day in 1968 has followed me for over 50 years now. This is my confession. My name is Frank Miller. I grew up in Marshalltown, Iowa, where winters dragged on forever, and teenage boys like me and my best friend Mike Thompson looked for any excuse to escape the monotony. We were 18 that winter, seniors in high school, with a week off in early December. Mike's uncle had a small cabin near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and we convinced our parents to let us drive out for a hunting trip. Looking back, I can't believe they agreed. But things were different then. 2 teenagers with rifles, a 1963 Chevy Impala, and 700 miles of open road. We left on December 3rd, 1968, before sunrise. The Impala's heater struggled against the 20-degree chill as we headed west on Highway 30. Mike drove the first leg while I fiddled with the radio, catching snippets of news about Richard Nixon's recent election victory between bursts of static. "This trip is going to be legendary," Mike said, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "My uncle says the hunting around Jackson Hole is prime this time of year. Deer everywhere." "As long as we don't freeze our asses off," I replied, rubbing my hands together. "How much farther?" "About 12 hours. We'll be there by nightfall if we don't stop much." The drive west took us through endless stretches of snowy farmland, then into Nebraska and the rolling hills. We switched drivers every few hours, stopping only for gas, bathroom breaks, and to grab sandwiches from roadside diners. As we crossed into Wyoming, the landscape changed dramatically. The Tetons rose in the distance, jagged and imposing against the gray December sky. We reached the cabin just after sunset. Mike's uncle hadn't been there in months, and the small wooden structure felt like an icebox. We unloaded our gear, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in for the night. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with questionable plumbing, and a main room with a kitchenette. Rustic was being generous. The next morning, we woke at dawn. Frost covered the inside of the windows. I could see my breath as I pulled on 3 layers of clothing: thermal underwear, flannel shirt, and my father's old hunting jacket. Mike was already in the main room, cleaning our rifles, a Remington 700 for him and my Winchester Model 70. Both were .30-06 caliber, powerful enough for deer or elk. "Weather report on the radio says clear skies today," Mike said. "Perfect hunting weather." We ate a quick breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, then loaded the car with our rifles, ammunition, and basic supplies. The plan was to drive along the Forest Service roads, looking for deer trails or other signs of game. We'd been hunting since we were 13, taught by our fathers who emphasized safety and respect for the animals. At least, that's what they taught us. What happened that day showed how little of those lessons we'd actually absorbed. We drove for about an hour, following winding roads that cut through snow-covered pines. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees, but the sun was bright, reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Around mid-morning, we turned onto a less maintained road that followed the edge of a valley. "Slow down," I said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Look at that." About 50 yards ahead, a coyote trotted across the road. It paused briefly, looking in our direction before continuing into the trees. Without a word, Mike stopped the car. Coyotes weren't what we'd come for, but the hunting had been slow, and the opportunity presented itself. He grabbed his rifle from the back seat and rolled down his window. "You got a shot?" I asked. "Not clean. It's moving into those trees." Mike put the car in gear and inched forward. "There, I see it between those pines." The coyote was about 40 yards away now, partially obscured by undergrowth. Mike raised his rifle, braced it against the doorframe, and fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the car. I saw snow kick up near the animal, which immediately bolted. "Damn it!" Mike exclaimed. "I think I hit it, but not clean." "There's blood," I said, pointing to dark spots in the snow. "We can track it." Mike parked the car on the side of the road. We grabbed our rifles, extra ammunition, and a small pack with water and beef jerky. The blood trail was easy to follow at first, bright crimson against pristine white. The coyote was heading uphill, away from the road into thicker forest. "Poor shot placement," Mike muttered as we followed the trail. "Should have waited for a better angle." "It's bleeding pretty good," I replied. "Probably won't go far." We tracked the blood for about 20 minutes, climbing steadily through pine forest. The drops became more sporadic as we went, forcing us to move slowly, scanning the ground carefully. The forest was silent except for the crunch of our boots in the snow and our increasingly labored breathing in the thin mountain air. The blood trail led us up a small rise. As we crested the hill, both of us stopped dead in our tracks. Standing about 300 feet away in a small clearing was something I couldn't immediately process. My brain first registered it as a bear, but that wasn't right. Bears don't stand upright like that, and it wasn't a man, though it was standing on 2 legs. It was dark, massive, covered in what looked like black fur or hair. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, raising his rifle slightly. The creature hadn't noticed us yet. It seemed to be looking down at something on the ground. Maybe the wounded coyote we'd been tracking. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful arms. The sun had dipped behind clouds, casting the clearing in grey light, but I could clearly see the creature's massive build and the steam of its breath in the cold air. What happened next still plays in slow motion in my memory. Without discussion or hesitation, Mike raised his rifle to his shoulder. I stood frozen, unable to speak or move. The scope of his Remington gleamed dully as he took aim. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees. The creature's head snapped up at the sound, and then it staggered backwards. It made no sound, no scream, no roar as it collapsed into the snow. "I hit it," Mike said, his voice a mix of shock and excitement. "Holy shit, I hit it!" Reality rushed back into me like cold water. "What the hell did you do that for?" I hissed. "I don't know," he replied, already moving forward. "I just reacted." We approached cautiously, rifles ready. My heart hammered in my chest as we closed the distance. The creature lay on its back in the snow, arms at its sides. Dark blood was spreading beneath it, staining the white ground. And then we saw its face. God help me, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't completely human either. But it was close enough to human that I felt immediate, crushing horror at what we'd done. The face was flat, with a short, broad nose and a wide mouth, no snout like a bear. The eyes were closed, but the lids fluttered slightly. Most disturbingly, its facial features were arranged in a distinctly human-like pattern, though the proportions were off, the brow more pronounced, the jaw heavier. Dark hair covered most of its body, but the face was relatively bare, exposing greyish-brown skin. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, taking an involuntary step back. "Mike, what is this thing?" The creature was enormous, at least 6.5 feet long, with a barrel chest and powerful limbs. Its hands, yes, hands, not paws, had 5 fingers with what looked like opposable thumbs. Those fingers twitched slightly as we stood there, indicating it was still alive. Mike had gone completely pale. His rifle hung limply at his side. I don't know what it is." "You shot it," I said, my voice rising. "Why did you shoot it?" "I panicked. I didn't think." His eyes were wide with fear. "Frank, look at it. It's not a bear. It's not a man. What the hell is it?" The creature's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Blood continued to pool beneath it, steaming slightly in the cold air. The bullet had struck it in the chest, and the wound looked fatal. Its eyelids fluttered again, and I had the terrible feeling it was aware of our presence. "We need to help it," I said, though I had no idea how. "We can't just leave it here to die." "Help it how?" Mike's voice cracked. "We're miles from anywhere. And what if this is something that's not supposed to exist?" That thought sent ice through my veins. Standing there, looking down at the creature, I realized we were facing something science couldn't explain. This wasn't a known animal. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else entirely. "We could be in serious trouble," Mike continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If this thing is part human, we could go to prison, or worse, they'll think we're crazy." The creature's breathing became more labored. One hand twitched, fingers curling slightly before relaxing again. Blood bubbled from the corner of its mouth. Shame and panic fought for dominance in my mind. We were watching something die, something intelligent enough to have a face that reflected pain and awareness. But Mike was right. What would happen if we reported this? Who would believe us? And if they did believe us, what then? "We need to go," Mike said suddenly, backing away. "Now! We can't just... It's dying, Frank," he hissed. "It'll be dead in minutes. There's nothing we can do except get ourselves in a world of trouble." I stood there, torn between basic human decency and self-preservation. The creature's eyes opened slightly, dark, intelligent eyes that locked onto mine for one terrible moment. I saw recognition there, understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. Then the eyes closed again. "Frank, come on!" Mike was already turning, heading back the way we'd come. I took one last look at the creature, mumbled something that might have been, "I'm sorry," and then followed Mike. We half ran, half stumbled down the hill, following our tracks back toward the road. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were our labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath our boots. We reached the car in record time. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently. I threw our rifles in the back seat and climbed in next to him. The engine roared to life, and Mike didn't wait for it to warm up before putting the car in gear and peeling away from the roadside. "Slow down," I said, as we fishtailed on the snow-covered road. "You'll get us killed." Mike eased off the gas slightly, but his knuckles remained white on the steering wheel. "What did we just see, Frank? What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know." My voice sounded hollow in my own ears, but we shot it. We shot something that looked partly human. "No one can know about this," Mike said firmly. "No one. Not ever." I nodded numbly, though part of me screamed that we should report it, that we should tell authorities what we'd found. But the image of that creature dying in the snow, the blood spreading beneath it, silenced that voice. We drove back to Iowa straight through, stopping only for gas. 14 hours of nearly complete silence. When we reached Marshalltown the next day, we told our parents the hunting had been poor and the weather had turned bad. No one questioned why we'd cut our trip short. No one knew what we'd done. For 7 years, we never spoke of it, not even to each other. I'd see Mike around town, and we'd nod hello, but the friendship was effectively over. Every time I looked at him, I saw that creature's face. Every time we spoke, I heard the crack of the rifle. The guilt was a wall between us. In 1975, I finally broke. I told my father everything one night after several beers. He listened without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You believe me, don't you?" I asked, desperate for someone to share this burden. "I believe you saw something," he replied carefully. "Whether it was what you think it was, I don't know, son." Word got around. Small towns can't keep secrets. A few months later, a researcher named Peter Byrne contacted me. He'd heard rumors about our encounter and wanted details. He specialized in tracking down stories of unknown creatures in North America. I agreed to meet with him, partly out of a need for validation and partly out of lingering guilt. Mike refused to speak with Peter. He'd gotten married, had a kid on the way, and wanted nothing to do with dredging up the past. I couldn't blame him. Peter was skeptical at first, but something in my account must have convinced him I was sincere. In the summer of 1976, he convinced me to return to Jackson Hole to try to locate the site of our encounter. By then, I'd moved to Cody, Wyoming, working as a high school history teacher. I was close enough that I couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious. We spent 3 days searching the area, but after 8 years, the landscape looked different. Logging had changed parts of the forest. New roads had been built. Or maybe I was deliberately leading us away from the actual location. I can't say for sure what my subconscious was doing. "You're certain it wasn't a bear?" Peter asked for the 10th time as we hiked through yet another section of forest. "Grizzlies can look remarkably human-like when standing." "It wasn't a bear," I said flatly. "Bears don't have hands with 5 fingers. Bears don't have flat faces with expressions that you can read. This thing, when it looked at me, there was intelligence there." Peter nodded, making notes in his small notebook. "And the hair color? Black, you said?" "Dark brown or black, yeah. Covered everything except the face." "No unusual smell?" "Many witnesses report a strong odor." I shook my head. "Not that I remember. We weren't close enough for long enough to notice." We never found the exact location. Maybe that was for the best. After 3 days, Peter thanked me for my time and left with his notes. He published something about our encounter in one of his newsletters about Bigfoot sightings, but my name was changed, and most people dismissed it as just another unverifiable story. That was 45 years ago. I've been a teacher in Wyoming ever since, watching generations of students pass through my classroom. I never married. The secret I carried seemed too heavy to share with someone who might love me. Mike died in 1998 from a heart attack, taking his version of events to the grave. I'm 70 now, still living in a small house outside Cody. On clear nights, I sometimes sit on my porch and look toward the mountains, wondering about what we encountered that day. Science has advanced. DNA testing exists now. If we'd reported it, if we'd brought back evidence, maybe we could have contributed something important to our understanding of the natural world. Or maybe we would have been laughed out of town, or arrested for shooting a protected species, or committed to psychiatric care. There's no way to know. What I do know is this. What we saw wasn't a bear, and it wasn't human. It was something in between, something science doesn't acknowledge, and we killed it out of fear and ignorance. I've carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest for over 50 years. Writing this account is the closest I've come to unburdening myself. Whether anyone believes it or not doesn't matter anymore. I know what I saw. I know what we did. And somewhere in the mountains near Jackson Hole, bones that don't belong to any known species lie buried beneath decades of snow and earth, evidence of a creature that walked the line between human and animal, whose existence remains unproven and whose death remains unaccounted for. That is my confession. That is my truth. Story 11. I've spent most of my life on the water. My daddy taught me how to fish when I was 4, barely tall enough to see over the side of his old aluminum boat. By the time I turned 12, I knew every fish species in southern Illinois by sight, smell, and the way they fought on the line. Catfishing became my specialty. The bigger and uglier, the better. 30 years of fishing those waters gave me confidence, maybe too much. July 18th, 2010, started like any other summer Sunday. The air hung thick with humidity as I loaded my gear into my pickup. I'd planned this solo trip to Washington County Lake for weeks, hoping to land a monster flathead catfish. The lake sits about 20 miles south of Nashville, Illinois. Not the famous one in Tennessee, but our little town of 200 people where everybody knows your business. I pulled into the lake's gravel parking lot at 5:30 p.m., just as the worst of the day's heat started to ease. The lot was empty except for one truck with a "Gone Fishin'" bumper sticker. The lake looked like glass, perfectly still in the evening light. I backed my trailer down the concrete ramp and slid my boat into the water with practiced ease. My 16-foot aluminum fishing boat wasn't fancy. Just a solid V-hull with a 25-horsepower Evinrude outboard, 2 swivel seats, and enough room for my cooler and tackle. I'd added some custom rod holders and a small depth finder a few years back. It had gotten me through hundreds of fishing trips without complaint. I started the engine with a pull of the cord and headed for my favorite spot, a quiet cove on the northeast side of the lake where the water deepens quickly. The bottom drops off to about 20 feet there, creating a perfect channel for big cats to move through. The shoreline curved in a small horseshoe shape, thick with oak and sycamore trees that crowded right up to the water's edge. The engine noise echoed across the water as I cut it to trolling speed approaching the cove. No other boats in sight. Perfect. I dropped anchor about 30 feet from shore and set up my gear. The sun had started its descent, painting the lake orange and red. I baited 3 rods with cut shad and chicken liver, casting them to different depths, then settled back in my seat. For the next few hours, I caught a steady stream of smaller catfish. Nothing worth bragging about, but enough action to keep me interested. The lake grew darker as night fell fully. I switched on my small battery lantern, creating a bubble of light that barely reached the water's surface. Stars appeared overhead, thousands of them in that clear country sky. The only sounds were crickets, frogs, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Around 11 p.m., I heard it for the first time. A heavy stomping noise from the wooded shoreline, like something large stepping on branches and leaves. I turned my head toward the sound, but could see nothing in the darkness beyond the reach of my lantern. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, turning back to my lines. 10 minutes later, another stomp, slightly closer, then another 15 minutes after that. The pattern continued, each sound seemingly deliberate. Still, I wasn't concerned. These woods had plenty of wildlife, deer, raccoons, maybe even wild hogs. Nothing worth getting worked up about. The fishing picked up around midnight. I landed a decent channel cat, maybe 12 pounds, followed by a smaller flathead. I cleaned them quickly, tossing the guts into the water on the opposite side of the boat from shore. In retrospect, maybe that wasn't the smartest move. At exactly 1:27 a.m., I remember checking my watch. Something changed. A massive splash erupted behind my boat, toward the shoreline, but not quite at the edge. The sound was like someone had thrown a refrigerator into the water. My boat rocked with the resulting wave. I spun around, heart suddenly hammering. "Hello?" I called out, grabbing my flashlight. I swept the beam across the water's surface and toward the tree line. Nothing. That splash came from at least 20 yards into the woods, too far for someone to throw anything from the shore without being seen. And whatever made that splash had to be heavy, much heavier than any rock a person could throw. I considered pulling anchor right then. Something felt wrong, but the rational part of my brain kicked in. Probably just a big branch falling into the water. Maybe a beaver dropped a log. I decided to stay. The stomping sounds stopped for about an hour. The fishing slowed too. By 3 a.m., I'd caught nothing for over an hour, and the breeze had picked up, creating a slight chill. Time to call it a night. I started reeling in my lines, stowing my gear methodically as I'd done thousands of times before. When I began pulling up the front anchor, I heard it again. Movement in the woods, but different now, more purposeful. Whatever it was seemed to be moving parallel to my boat as I drifted slowly along the shoreline. I pulled the second anchor and started the outboard with a roar that shattered the night's quiet. As I steered away from the cove, the sounds from the woods continued. Something was following me. The realization sent ice through my veins. I increased my speed, navigating by the light of my small bow lamp. The shoreline was thick with trees and undergrowth, making it impossible to see what was moving in there, but something definitely was. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, heavy footfalls matched my boat's pace. This went on for nearly 4 miles as I followed the curving shoreline toward the boat ramp. Whatever it was, kept perfect pace with me at about 15 miles per hour, too fast for a person to maintain through dense woods, too deliberate for an animal spooked by my engine noise. Only when I approached the well-lit dock area did the sound stop. The parking lot had bright mercury vapor lights mounted on tall poles, casting harsh white light across the concrete ramp and surrounding area. I pulled up to the dock, hands shaking slightly as I tied off the boat. The parking lot was completely empty now. The other fishermen from earlier had long gone. Just my truck and trailer waiting in the artificial glow of the lights. As I gathered my tackle box and cooler, a deep grunt echoed from the tree line at the edge of the lot. Not a human sound, not quite animal either, something in between. I froze, then slowly turned toward the sound. I placed my gear in the boat and walked to my truck, never taking my eyes off the woods. I unlocked the door, climbed inside, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the first row of trees about 50 feet away. 2 yellow eyes reflected back at me. Not small eyes like a raccoon or possum. Not even deer eyes. These were massive, round yellow orbs, set about 8 feet off the ground. They didn't blink as they stared back at me. I threw the truck into reverse, backing up to the trailer. My hands trembled as I hooked the boat up, working faster than I ever had before. The whole time, those eyes watched from the darkness. Once the boat was secured, I climbed back into my truck and pulled away from the ramp. The access road wound through nearly 2 miles of dark forest before reaching the highway. Trees crowded close to the narrow pavement, creating a tunnel of darkness, broken only by my headlights. I'd gone about half a mile when something hit the right side of my boat with a loud bang. The impact was hard enough to rock my truck. I slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the gravel-strewn asphalt. "What the hell?" I whispered, peering into my side mirror. Nothing there, just darkness. I put the truck back in drive and accelerated. Another 100 yards down the road, bang, another hit, harder this time. I fought the wheel to keep the truck straight. This time I stopped and looked back through the rear window. My blood turned to ice water. A massive dark figure stood beside my boat. In the dim red glow of my taillights, I could make out only its outline, broad shoulders, long arms, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. Too big, too something else. I stomped on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on loose gravel before catching. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure move, not running but covering ground with impossible speed, eating up the distance between us. At about 35 miles per hour, with the creature no more than 20 feet behind my trailer, something slammed into the passenger side of my truck. The impact was violent enough to push the whole vehicle sideways. Metal crumpled with a sickening crunch. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept that gas pedal mashed to the floor, fishtailing around curves, praying I wouldn't slide off the road. The highway seemed miles away. When my headlights finally illuminated the stop sign at the highway intersection, relief flooded through me. I blew through it without stopping, turning north toward Nashville. Only when the illuminated sign for the Conoco station came into view did I ease off the gas. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot and sat there, engine running, breathing hard. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Sweat soaked my shirt despite the air conditioning blasting at full power. After maybe 15 minutes, I worked up the courage to step outside. The night was quiet now, just the normal sounds of crickets and the occasional passing car on the highway. I walked around to the passenger side of my truck and stopped cold. A massive dent caved in the sheet metal of the door and bed, higher than the window line. Whatever hit my truck had struck it at least 5 feet off the ground, with enough force to crumple quarter-inch steel. I ran my fingers over the damaged metal. No paint transfer, no fur, nothing to indicate what had caused it. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors. I didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke, I loaded my Remington 870 shotgun and drove back to the lake, determined to find tracks, broken branches, any evidence of what I'd encountered. I found nothing. No unusual tracks, no broken vegetation besides what looked like normal deer trails. The lake was already busy with morning fishermen, families setting up picnics, kids splashing in the designated swimming area. Normal Sunday activities in a world that suddenly felt less normal to me. That was 13 years ago. I still fish Washington County Lake, but never alone, never at night. I've told a few close friends about what happened, but most just laugh it off. Blame it on too many beers or my imagination. I know what I saw. I know what hit my truck. The dent remained until I finally sold it 3 years later. The new owner asked what happened, and I told him I'd hit a deer. Easier than the truth. Sometimes when I'm on the water and the sun starts to set, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, listening for those heavy footsteps. I've talked to other fishermen, casually asking if they've ever experienced anything strange at the lake. Most haven't, but a few get a certain look in their eyes, like they've seen something they can't explain either. Washington County Lake covers almost 300 acres, surrounded by miles of dense forest. Plenty of places for something to hide. Something that can keep pace with a boat for miles. Something strong enough to dent a moving vehicle. Something with yellow eyes that shine in the dark. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But on windy nights when branches scrape against my bedroom window, I remember those footsteps, that splash, those eyes, and I keep my shotgun close. Story 12. I've always been a practical man. 23 years working power lines taught me what's real. Electricity, steel, gravity, those are the things that'll kill you if you don't respect them. But what I saw that October night, 7 years ago in the Pisgah National Forest, doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. I've kept it mostly to myself, except for a few times when the bourbon loosened my tongue. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a little. My name's Ray Cutler. I work for Mountain Electric Cooperative out of Ashton County. That night started like dozens of others. A call from dispatch about a transmission tower down in the National Forest. Some research facility needed that tower. Apparently they monitored wildlife or weather patterns or something government-related. Didn't matter much to me. Power was out, and it was my job to fix it. The clock read 10:17 p.m. when I pulled out of my driveway in the company truck. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and a light rain had just stopped. The kind of chill that gets into your bones. I remember the dash lights illuminating the cab as I turned onto Route 16 toward the Forest Access Road. Pisgah's a massive place, over 500,000 acres of woodland. The access road cuts through about 12 miles of it before reaching the research station and transmission tower. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, barely reaching the dense wall of trees on either side. No moon that night, just pitch black beyond the reach of my lights. The radio crackled with static as I made the turn onto Forest Service Road 2174, a gravel track that wound deeper into the woods. The truck bounced and rattled over the uneven surface. I killed the radio. Nothing but static out there anyway. First stop was the transmission tower itself to assess the situation. When I arrived, the place stood dark and silent against the night sky. I grabbed my flashlight and walked the perimeter, checking connections and looking for obvious damage. Nothing. That meant the problem had to be somewhere along the line. I got back in the truck and started driving slowly along the service road that paralleled the power line, scanning upward with my spotlight. The trees closed in tighter here, branches sometimes scraping against the truck. The spotlight beam caught the power poles one by one, everything looking normal until I reached pole number 37. There it was, a broken insulator. One of the ceramic bells had shattered, probably from a lightning strike or a fallen branch. The line wasn't down, but it had made contact with the crossarm, causing a short. This was a two-person job. I couldn't repair it alone. I pulled over, cut the engine, and called Jake Burnett. Jake's been my colleague for going on 15 years. Dependable, doesn't talk much. Jake, it's Ray. Got a busted insulator on pole 37 off Forest Service Road 2174. About 8 miles in. Need the bucket truck. Jake grunted his acknowledgement. Be there in 30. While waiting, I sat in the truck with the engine running and heater on low. The forest at night has a way of making you feel small. Through the windshield, I could see the trees swaying gently in the breeze, their movement causing strange shadows in my headlights. An owl called somewhere nearby, its voice carrying easily through the still night air. Jake arrived at 11:35 p.m. I could hear the bucket truck's diesel engine long before I saw its headlights. He'd brought Mason Phillips with him, a younger guy who'd been with the company maybe 3 years. Good worker, though still learning. Same shit, different night, Jake said as he stepped out of the truck. He was dressed in thick Carhartt coveralls and a company cap pulled low over his eyes. Broken insulator up there, I pointed with my flashlight. Mason, you mind taking the bucket up? Mason nodded, already pulling on his safety harness. No problem. Jake backed the bucket truck into position beneath the pole while I set up the portable floodlights to illuminate the work area. The bright lights created harsh shadows against the trees, making the forest beyond seem even darker by comparison. With the truck positioned correctly, Mason climbed into the bucket with his tool belt and replacement insulator. Jake operated the controls, raising him slowly toward the damaged equipment. The hydraulics whined in the quiet night as the bucket ascended. Jake and I stood on the gravel road, our breath forming clouds in the cold air. We talked about nothing important. The football game from the weekend, Jake's new fishing boat, the overtime we'd both been putting in since the storms last month. Mason called down occasionally with updates. The damage was worse than it looked from the ground. He'd need to replace not just the insulator, but part of the crossarm too. That's when it happened. Something caught my eye. Movement at the edge of the light. My first thought was deer. We see them all the time out there. But this movement was different, deliberate, tall. I turned my head and saw it coming down the embankment on the opposite side of the road. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. A dark shape moving between the trees, walking upright on two legs. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks after staring at the bright work lights. But when I looked again, it was still there, closer now. Moving with a smooth, purposeful stride, unlike anything I'd ever seen in nature. "Jake," I said, my voice coming out strange and tight. Jake must have heard something in my tone because he stopped mid-sentence and followed my gaze. The thing, and I don't know what else to call it, stepped onto the road about 50 yards from where we stood. The headlights from Jake's truck caught it full on now, and I felt my stomach drop. It was massive, 7 feet tall at minimum, probably closer to 8. Built like a linebacker, but with proportions all wrong for a human. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, hunched slightly forward as it walked. No neck that I could see. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. And the hair. Jesus Christ, the hair. Thick, shaggy, covering its entire body. In the headlights I could see it was a brownish-grey colour, darker in some places, lighter in others. Not uniform like a bear's coat. It moved across the road with a fluid gait, taking only a few strides to cross the entire width. Its arms hung at its sides, longer than a man's should be, swinging slightly with each step. I couldn't make out a face, just a darker shadow where features should have been. Neither Jake nor I moved. I couldn't have run if I wanted to. My legs felt rooted to the spot. The creature never looked our way, never gave any indication it even noticed us standing there. It simply crossed the road and disappeared into the trees on our side, the branches barely moving as it passed through them. The entire encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds, 10 seconds that changed everything I thought I knew. After it vanished from sight, I became aware of a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. As if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, gradually, the night sounds returned, first distant, then closer, until everything seemed normal again. Except nothing was normal. Above us, Mason continued working, his back to the road, completely oblivious to what had just happened. The mechanical sounds of his tools seemed obscenely loud in the aftermath. "Did you—" I started to say. Jake cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. His face looked pale in the work lights, his eyes wide. Neither of us spoke another word about it while Mason finished the repairs. When the bucket lowered back to the truck, Mason was grinning with satisfaction at a job well done. "Should hold now. Replace the whole damn assembly to be safe." Jake nodded mechanically. "Good job. Let's pack up." We collected the tools and floodlights in record time. Nobody wanted to linger. Mason seemed confused by our sudden rush, but didn't question it. He rode with Jake in the bucket truck, while I followed in my vehicle. The drive back was the longest of my life. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might step onto the road. Every dark patch beyond my headlights seemed to hide watching eyes. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other hovering near the door handle, though what good that would have done I couldn't tell you. For days afterward, Jake and I avoided each other at the service center. We'd nod in passing, but never stopped to talk. Mason asked me once if something had happened that night, saying Jake was acting strange. I brushed it off, blamed it on fatigue. A week passed before Jake finally approached me in the parking lot after our shifts ended. "You want a beer?" he asked, not looking me in the eye. We drove separately to Donna's Tavern, a place outside of town where we sometimes stopped after work. The bar was nearly empty on a Wednesday night. We took a booth in the back and ordered 2 beers. After the waitress left, Jake leaned forward. "About that night?" "Yeah," I said, relieved he'd brought it up first. "What do you think it was?" I asked. Jake took a long pull from his beer before answering. "I don't know," he said finally, "and I don't want to know." That was all he'd say on the matter. We finished our beers, talking about other things. but the subject hung between us like a physical presence. Later, I started doing some research. Turns out there have been other sightings in Pisgah over the years. Hunters reporting large, hair-covered figures moving through trees at distances too great for a clear view. Hikers describing strange, guttural sounds at night that didn't match any known wildlife. Park rangers finding unusual tracks that didn't correspond to any catalogued species. Most people dismiss these stories. I would have too before that night. It's easier to believe in a misidentified bear or an overactive imagination than to accept that something unknown walks in those woods. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk exclusively on two legs for that distance with that gait. It wasn't a person in a costume. No costume could replicate that natural movement, that sense of raw physical power. I still work for Mountain Electric, still go into Pisgah when duty calls, but I never go alone anymore, and I'm always back before dark. Jake does the same. We've never discussed that night again, but sometimes our eyes meet across the service center, and I know he's thinking about it too. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I try not to believe it myself. But on dark nights, when the wind moves through the trees outside my bedroom window, I remember the fluid way that thing moved, the absolute silence that followed its passing, the certainty that it belonged to those woods in a way that I never will. And I wonder how many other times it's watched me from the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, as I worked on those remote lines. How many times I've been observed without knowing it. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some knowledge isn't meant for us. But one thing I do know. I wasn't the first to see it in those woods, and I won't be the last. Story 13. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of my desk, staring out the classroom window at the woods behind Oak Ridge Elementary. Those trees looked different to me now. Every shadow between the trunks made my stomach tighten. Mrs. Peterson droned on about fractions, but I couldn't focus. Not since what happened 5 days ago. I'm Ethan Foster. I'm 9 years old, and I saw something in those woods that nobody believes. It started after school last Thursday. Me and my best friend Jimmy Carter, yeah, like the president, he hates it when people point that out, were kicking my soccer ball around the field while waiting for our parents. My dad works late on Thursdays, so I always hang around until 5:30. Jimmy's mum was running late too. "Bet you can't stop this one," Jimmy yelled, drawing his leg back. I crouched, ready. "Bring it!" He kicked hard but sent it wide. I dove but missed completely, landing face first in the dirt as the ball sailed past me toward the tree line. The sun was already getting low, casting long shadows across the field. "Nice save, Butterfingers," Jimmy laughed, helping me up. I brushed dirt from my jeans. "Whatever, let's just get the ball." We jogged toward where the ball had disappeared into the underbrush. The trees formed a dark wall at the edge of the school grounds. I'd been in these woods hundreds of times during daylight, building forts with Jimmy or collecting cool-looking rocks. But at dusk, with the shadows stretching like fingers across the ground, everything looked different. Jimmy stopped at the tree line. "You kicked it. You go get it." "You kicked it," I corrected him. "Fine," Jimmy sighed, "but you're coming too." We stepped between the trees, the temperature dropping immediately. The school field was still glowing orange with the setting sun, but under the canopy it was already getting dark. Twigs snapped under our sneakers. The familiar woods seemed to close in around us. "Do you see it?" I asked, scanning the ground. Jimmy pointed ahead. "I think it went over there." We moved deeper, maybe 30 yards in. The sounds of the school playground faded. All I could hear was our breathing and the rustle of leaves overhead. The trees grew thicker here and the light dimmer. "There it is." Jimmy spotted the ball first, pointing to where it had rolled against a fallen log. I took a step forward, but then froze. A loud snap echoed through the trees, not like a twig underfoot, but like a thick branch breaking. Jimmy heard it too. We both stood completely still. "What was that?" he whispered. I shook my head, my eyes darting between the shadowy trunks. The ball had wedged itself between two exposed tree roots. Jimmy nudged me forward. "Hurry up and grab it." I crept toward the ball, bending down to reach between the roots. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, partially hidden between two massive oak trees, something moved, something tall. Much taller than my dad, who's 6'2". It was dark, covered in hair or fur that looked matted and thick. The shape was vaguely human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But wrong somehow. Too big, too bulky. It shifted its weight, and I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting what little light remained. My hand froze inches from the ball. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't make a sound. The figure moved again, turning slightly, as if it had noticed us too. I reached back without looking, grabbing Jimmy's sleeve and tugging hard. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "See what?" Jimmy pulled away, looking confused. That thing, over there." I pointed, but the figure had shifted behind a tree, mostly hidden now. Between those trees, something big. Jimmy squinted in the direction I pointed. "I don't see anything, man. It's getting dark. Just grab the ball." I looked back. The shape seemed to have moved slightly closer, though I couldn't tell for sure in the deepening shadows. I lunged forward, snatched the ball, and backed away quickly. "Let's go," I said, already turning. "Right now." Maybe Jimmy heard the fear in my voice, or maybe he was just getting spooked by the darkening woods himself, but he didn't argue. We ran, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I didn't look back, not once. The ball clutched against my chest. We burst from the tree line back onto the school field, now bathed in the red-orange glow of sunset. We didn't stop running until we reached the playground. "What's wrong with you?" Jimmy panted, doubling over with his hands on his knees. "Didn't you see it?" I was still catching my breath. "See what?" That thing in the woods. It was huge, Jimmy. Covered in dark hair, standing on 2 legs. Jimmy straightened up, giving me a look like I just told him I'd seen a dragon. "No way, you're making that up." "I'm not. It was right there." "Whatever, man. You're trying to scare me." Before I could argue further, Jimmy's mom's minivan pulled up to the curb. He grabbed his backpack from where we'd left it by the playground. "See you tomorrow, weirdo," he called back, jogging to his mum's car. I stood alone, clutching my soccer ball, staring back at the darkened woods. I couldn't see anything moving among the trees now, but I felt like something was still watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape between the trees. I told myself it was probably just a bear, though I knew bears weren't common around Oak Ridge. Maybe it was someone wearing a bulky coat, or maybe I'd just imagined it in the growing darkness. But I knew what I'd seen. Something huge, something not human. I didn't tell my dad that night, or the next morning. How could I? He'd think I was making it up for attention, or that I'd been playing too many video games. By Saturday, though, the secret was eating me up inside. Jimmy had already texted me saying I was crazy, that there wasn't anything in those woods. Dad was making pancakes when I finally broke. "Dad," I said, pushing my syrup-soaked pancake around the plate, "if I tell you something weird, do you promise not to laugh at me?" He turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "I promise, buddy. What's up?" I took a deep breath. "I saw something in the woods behind school on Thursday." Dad sat down across from me, his expression serious. "What kind of something?" "Something big. Really big. Like taller than you." The words came tumbling out. "It was covered in dark hair, and it was standing on 2 legs, watching us. Jimmy didn't see it, and he thinks I'm crazy, but I know what I saw, Dad. I expected him to laugh, or to tell me it was my imagination. Instead, he just studied my face." "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Were you scared?" he asked. Yeah, really scared. He sipped his coffee, thinking, "You know what? I think we should report this." "Report it? To who?" "To the police." He held up his hand when my eyes widened. "Not because you're in trouble, but because if there's someone or something strange in those woods, they should know about it." 2 hours later, we were sitting in the Oak Ridge Police Department. The station was small, just a converted house with the town seal on the door. Inside, it smelled like coffee and paper. Officer Daniels took us into a small room with a desk and 2 chairs. He was tall and thin, with a mustache that reminded me of an old-time sheriff. "So, Ethan," he said, clicking his pen, "your dad says you saw something unusual in the woods behind Oak Ridge Elementary." I nodded, suddenly feeling silly. What if he thought I was wasting his time? "Can you tell me exactly what you saw? Take your time." I described everything: the soccer ball, the woods getting dark, the snap of the branch, and the tall, hairy figure watching us from between the trees. Officer Daniels didn't laugh. He wrote everything down, nodding occasionally. Then he asked questions I wasn't expecting. "How tall would you say this figure was? Taller than your dad?" "Yeah, way taller. Maybe 7 or 8 feet. "And the hair or fur? What color was it? Dark brown or black?" It was hard to see clearly. "Did it make any sounds? Any smells?" I shook my head. "I didn't hear anything except that branch breaking, and I was too far away to smell anything." "Did it seem to notice you? Did it move toward you or away from you?" "I think it saw us. It sort of shifted, like it turned to look at us better." I swallowed hard, remembering. "I think it might have started moving closer, but I grabbed the ball and we ran." Officer Daniels finished writing and closed his notebook. "Thank you, Ethan. You did the right thing coming in. We'll check it out." As we were leaving, I heard him tell my dad they'd send someone to look around the area. But his tone had changed. He didn't believe me either. On Tuesday after school, Dad got a call from the police department. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing math homework when his phone rang. "Hello? Yes, this is him." Dad walked into the living room, but I could still hear him. "Oh, I see. A groundskeeper? Well, that would explain it. Thank you for letting us know." He came back and sat across from me. "That was Officer Daniels. They think they figured out what you saw." My pencil stopped moving. "What?" "They talked to the school, and apparently there's a groundskeeper who sometimes works late clearing brush at the edge of the woods. Big guy, wears a dark work jacket. They think that's probably who you spotted." I stared at him. "Dad, no. This wasn't a person. It was way too big." "In the shadows, at dusk, your eyes can play tricks on you," he said gently. "And you were already spooked from being in the dark woods." "But—" "Ethan, the police checked it out. That's the most logical explanation." I knew arguing wouldn't help. Adults always think they know better, but I knew what I saw wasn't a groundskeeper. No jacket looks like matted fur. No person is 8 feet tall with eyes that catch the light like an animal's. 3 weeks passed. Nobody at school believed me either. Jimmy told a couple of kids, who told more kids, and soon I was Bigfoot boy. I stopped talking about it completely, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. One day after school, I went to the Oak Ridge Public Library. Mrs. Wilson, the librarian, knew me well from all the Hardy Boys mysteries I checked out. "Can I help you find something, Ethan?" she asked as I wandered through the non-fiction section. "Do you have any books about, Bigfoot? Or strange creatures people have seen?" If she thought this was a weird request, she didn't show it. She led me to a shelf near the back. "We have a few books on cryptozoology. That's the study of animals that might exist, but haven't been proven real yet." She pulled down 3 books: Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, Mysterious America, and Unexplained Encounters in the American Northwest. "Thank you," I said, carrying them to a quiet table in the corner. For the next 2 hours, I read story after story of people who'd seen things in the woods that they couldn't explain. Some of the descriptions matched exactly what I'd seen. Tall, hairy creatures that walked on two legs, moving silently through forests all over America. Some witnesses were kids like me, but others were hunters, park rangers, and even police officers. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the only one who'd seen something impossible. I borrowed all 3 books, hiding them in my backpack. Over the next few weeks, I read everything I could find about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious forest creatures. I learned about footprint casts, hair samples, and recordings of strange howls in the night. I studied maps showing where sightings had occurred across the country. Oak Ridge wasn't on any of those maps. Not yet. Summer came, and with it, freedom from being Bigfoot boy at school. Jimmy and I started hanging out again, though we never talked about what happened in the woods. Sometimes, when we were playing video games or riding bikes, I'd forget about it for a while. But I never went back into those woods alone, and I never stayed outside after dusk if I could help it. One hot July afternoon, Dad took me fishing at Mercer Lake, about 20 miles from Oak Ridge. We sat on the dock, lines cast into the still water, talking about baseball and my upcoming 5th grade year. "Dad," I said, watching my bobber drift, "remember that thing I saw in the woods?" He sighed. "Ethan, we talked about this. It was the groundskeeper. Just hear me out. I've been reading these books. Books about Bigfoot." He shook his head. "I've seen them in your room. But Dad, there are so many people who've seen the same thing I did, all over the country. They can't all be wrong." He reeled in his empty hook, casting again before answering. "I'm not saying you're lying about what you saw. I believe you saw something that scared you. But our eyes and minds can trick us, especially in low light, especially when we're already nervous. So you think I imagined it? I think you saw something real, probably that groundskeeper. And in the darkness and fear, your mind filled in the gaps with something else." I wanted to argue, but a tug on my line interrupted us. I reeled in a small base, and the conversation shifted to fishing techniques and what we'd have for dinner. But I knew what I'd seen. No amount of logical explanations could erase the memory of that tall, dark figure watching me from between the trees. It's been 4 months now since that day in the woods. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes I think I hear heavy footsteps outside my window at night. Mom says it's just raccoons in the trash cans. I don't try to convince people anymore. I keep my books on cryptids and unexplained phenomena to myself. But I know I'm not alone. Somewhere out there, other people have seen things they can't explain. Things that shouldn't exist, but do. Last week I started a journal where I write down everything I remember about my encounter. Every detail, no matter how small. Someday, maybe I'll have proof. Or maybe I'll meet someone else who's seen what I've seen. Someone who won't look at me like I'm crazy. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods. And I know somewhere in those trees, something is watching back. Story 14. I felt the cold seep through my sleeping bag as the first hint of dawn filtered through the frosted windows of my truck. My son Tommy stirred beside me, his breath making small clouds in the December air. We'd parked halfway up Forest Service Road 3099 last night when the snow got too deep, even for my lifted F-250. The back of the truck bed wasn't the Marriott, but it beat trying to push through another half-mile of fresh powder in the dark. "Time to get moving, son," I whispered, reaching for my thermos. The coffee inside had stayed warm enough, and I took a long swig before passing it to Tommy. At 21, he was finally filling out into a man's frame, but he still had his mother's eyes. This was our 3rd elk season together since she passed. "Jesus, Dad, it's cold as hell," Tommy mumbled, sitting up and rubbing his face. "Language," I said automatically, though my heart wasn't in it. "And hell's supposed to be hot anyway." We dressed in layers, thermal underwear, flannel, down vests, and waterproof shells. I checked my bow case while Tommy strapped on his snowshoes. This late in the season, the elk would be moving to lower elevations, and Independence Creek had never failed us before. "Got the GPS?" I asked, though I knew we wouldn't need it much. Back in September, when the woods were still green, I'd marked our route with bright pink reflective tape, the kind that catches headlights or flashlight beams. Simple old-school insurance against getting turned around. Tommy patted his pocket. "Got it, and extra batteries." We locked up the truck and set out just as the sky turned from charcoal to steel grey. The snow squeaked beneath our snowshoes, and our breath came out in great white plumes. Tommy took point, breaking trail through 18 inches of fresh powder. "Slow and steady," I reminded him. "We've got all day." For 30 years I'd hunted these mountains, knew them better than I knew the back roads around our place in Coeur d'Alene. The snowfall had transformed everything, but the contours of the land were familiar beneath the white blanket. We worked our way upslope through a stand of lodgepole pines, their branches sagging under snow. After about an hour, we reached the ridge where the elk often crossed. Tommy spotted the first piece of pink tape fluttering from a Douglas fir. "Trail's still good," he called back. I nodded, conserving breath in the thin mountain air. At 53, I wasn't old, but I wasn't a spring chicken either. The altitude made itself known in my lungs. We pushed on, following my tape markers. Some had been partially buried by snow, but Tommy had sharp eyes. The woods were silent, except for our labored breathing and the occasional clump of snow falling from overhead branches. Around 9:30, we hit a problem. The trail should have bent eastward toward a small clearing the elk used to graze, but we couldn't spot the next marker. "Dad, you sure it was this way?" Tommy had stopped, scanning the tree line. "Positive." I pulled out my compass. The bearing looked right, but the snow had changed everything. "Let's fan out a bit, the tape should catch the light." Tommy went left while I took the right. 20 yards out, I heard him whistle, our signal. "Got it." He was pointing upslope. I trudged over, relieved but puzzled. I'd marked a fairly straight path in September. This deviation seemed odd. "Must have gotten turned around when I was marking it," I muttered, more to myself than to Tommy. We continued climbing, finding the markers more regularly now. The routine resumed. Spot the tape, move toward it, scan for the next one. The sun broke through the clouds around 10:15, making the snow sparkle like crushed glass. That's when we saw it. Tommy froze mid-stride. I nearly bumped into him. "What the hell?" he whispered. I followed his gaze upward. A piece of my pink reflective tape was tied to a thin branch, fluttering in the slight breeze. Nothing unusual about that, except this branch was a good 12 feet off the ground, extending about 6 feet from the trunk. The branch itself couldn't have been more than 2 inches thick. "Did you put that there?" Tommy asked, turning to look at me. I shook my head slowly. "No way I could reach that high. I'm 5'5", for Christ's sake." We both stared at the tape. It was definitely mine. Same bright pink, same reflective strip down the middle. But there was no way, absolutely no way, I had placed it there 3 months ago. "Maybe someone else found your tape and moved it. Hunters messing with other hunters," Tommy suggested, but his voice had a tight edge to it. I scanned the snow around the tree. Pristine, undisturbed. No tracks but our own leading up to this spot. "Look around," I said. "Nobody's been through here." The tape fluttered again. It had been tied in a neat bow, exactly like all my other markers. "Could have been before the snow," Tommy said, but we both knew the last major snowfall had been 4 days ago. Any tracks would still be visible as depressions, even if partially filled. "Let me check something," I said, walking carefully around the tree in a wide circle. Nothing. No indication anyone had climbed it or used a ladder. Besides, the terrain was too steep and rugged to haul equipment up here. I took out my rangefinder and measured the height. 12.4 feet to the tape. "Maybe a bear climbed up and—" Tommy started. "Bears are denned up this time of year." I cut him off, "and they don't tie neat bows with reflective tape." We stood there for a full minute, just staring at that fluttering piece of pink tape. The silence of the forest pressed in around us. I realized I couldn't hear any birds or squirrels, nothing. "Should we keep going?" Tommy finally asked. I hesitated. I'd been hunting these mountains for decades. I'd seen weird things, lights in the sky that moved too fast for aircraft, strange sounds that didn't match any animal I knew. But this was different. This felt deliberate. "Yeah," I said finally. "Let's keep going, but stay close." We continued following the markers, but the rhythm of our hunt was broken. Every few minutes I caught Tommy looking over his shoulder. I was doing the same. The trail led us to a small clearing that sloped down to Independence Creek. In September, I'd seen a 6-point bull here with 3 cows. Today, the clearing was empty, a blanket of untouched snow. "Let's set up here for a bit," I suggested. "The creek's the only water source not frozen solid. If they're moving, they'll come through." We found a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and brushed off the snow. I pulled out our lunch, sandwiches, jerky, and a thermos of hot chocolate. We ate in silence, scanning the woods. "Dad," Tommy said finally, his voice low, "what do you think moved that tape?" I chewed slowly, considering my answer. "Don't know. Wind could have torn it off somewhere else, and it got caught up there." "That wasn't caught. It was tied. Same knot as all the others." He was right, of course. I'd been tying the same bow on my trail markers for 30 years. "Maybe some kids hiking through," I offered, but the explanation sounded weak even to me. "In December? This far out?" Tommy shook his head. "And how'd they reach that high?" I didn't have an answer for him. We sat for another hour, but no elk appeared. The woods remained unnaturally quiet. No chickadees or nuthatches, no red squirrels chattering, just the occasional soft plop of snow falling from branches. "Let's move on," I said finally. "There's another crossing about half a mile up." We followed the creek, finding my markers at regular intervals. All were where I'd left them, at eye level, easily visible with a flashlight. But I couldn't shake the image of that one piece of tape fluttering 12 feet up. The second clearing showed more promise. There were tracks, 2 days old at least, partially filled with snow, but definitely elk. We found droppings and places where they'd poured through the snow to reach the grass beneath. "This is more like it," Tommy whispered, excitement returning to his voice. We set up in a natural blind created by a cluster of young firs. The wind was in our favor, blowing our scent away from the likely approach path. I nocked an arrow and settled in to wait. The short winter day was already waning, the shadows growing longer across the snow. We'd have to start back in an hour at most to reach the truck before full dark. That's when I heard it, a soft snap of a branch off to our left. Not from the direction we expected the elk to come. I turned my head slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. Nothing, just trees and snow. Another snap, closer this time. Tommy had heard it too. He turned slightly, bow half raised. Then I saw movement, just a flicker between trees about 40 yards out. Too fast for an elk, not the right profile either. "Did you see that?" Tommy breathed. I nodded once, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot. For 10 long seconds nothing moved. Then very distinctly I heard something that made my blood run cold. 3 deliberate taps on a tree trunk. Like knocking, like a signal. Tap, tap, tap. Tommy's eyes widened. I put my finger to my lips. We waited, frozen in our hiding spot. The woods fell silent again. The light was fading fast now, the temperature dropping with the sun. "Time to head back," I whispered. "Nice and easy. No rush." Tommy nodded, his face pale. We backed out of our blind, arrows still nocked, but pointed at the ground. I kept my eyes scanning the tree line, where I'd seen the movement. Nothing moved as we gathered our gear. Nothing followed as we started back down our trail. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The skin on the back of my neck prickled despite the cold. We walked faster than we had on the way in, following our own tracks back through the snow. The markers seemed different somehow on the return journey. Too regularly spaced, too deliberately placed. Had they always been like that? I couldn't remember. We reached the spot with the high-placed tape marker just as the last light was fading from the sky. It fluttered in the dying day, catching the beam of my flashlight. "Don't stop," I told Tommy, moving past the tree without pausing. The downhill trek was faster but treacherous in the growing darkness. We stumbled several times on hidden roots and rocks beneath the snow. My flashlight beam bounced crazily across the landscape, creating strange, moving shadows among the trees. Was that movement behind that massive Douglas fir? Just the wind, I told myself. Just branches swaying. We were maybe a quarter-mile from the truck when Tommy grabbed my arm. "Listen," he hissed. I stopped, killed my flashlight. In the sudden darkness, I strained my ears. Soft, rhythmic crunching in the snow. Something walking, something big, not following our exact path, but paralleling it about 50 yards to our right. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then it stopped. We waited, barely breathing. 10 seconds, 20, 30, tap, 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 just like before. Wood on wood. Deliberate. "Go," I whispered. "Straight to the truck. Don't run unless I say run." We moved forward, no longer concerned with stealth. Whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. I switched my flashlight back on, sweeping it in wide arcs as we walked. The truck appeared ahead, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. We covered the last 100 yards quickly, our snowshoes clumsy in our haste. I fumbled with the keys, unlocked the doors. We threw our gear in the back and climbed in. Only when I had the engine running and the heater blasting did I feel some of the tension leave my shoulders. "What the hell was that, Dad?" Tommy's voice shook slightly. I put the truck in gear, turned it around carefully on the narrow forest road. "Don't know. Something big." "Bear? You said they were denned up." "Most are." I flipped on the high beams, illuminating the snowy road ahead. Could be a lot of things. We drove in silence for several miles. The Forest Service road was slick but passable. Once we hit the main highway, I felt Tommy relax slightly beside me. "That tape," he said finally. "Something put it up there on purpose, didn't it?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Looks that way." "Why? What's the point?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. Maybe to show it knew what the tape was for, that it understood. Tommy looked out at the dark forest sliding past his window. "That's messed up." We reached Coeur d'Alene around 8:30 p.m. The town's lights felt impossibly bright and normal after the darkness of the forest. I pulled into our driveway, killed the engine. "You know," I said before we got out, "I've got a buddy, Hank Mercer, who investigates Bigfoot sightings." Tommy snorted. "Seriously, Dad? Bigfoot?" "I'm not saying that's what it was," I said carefully. "But Hank told me about a hunter down in Oregon last year. Guy used the same pink tape to mark his trail. Found one piece tied to his horse's mane one morning. Horse was spooked but unhurt." Tommy stared at me. "You believe that?" "I believe what I saw today. Tape 12 feet up where I didn't put it. Something moving through those woods that wasn't an elk." We sat in silence for another minute. "You going back?" Tommy finally asked. I thought about the tapping sounds, about that deliberate knocking, about something intelligent enough to understand what my trail markers were for and move one where I couldn't possibly reach. "Yeah," I said, "but not this season." We unloaded our gear, went inside to warmth and light and normalcy, but I knew I'd be back to Independence Creek eventually. Something out there had sent a message, had communicated in the only way it could. Not threatening, not aggressive, just letting me know it was there, that it noticed me, that I wasn't the only one who knew how to mark a trail. Story 15, Dusty. I still hear it sometimes, that sound. It wasn't like anything on this earth should make. Been 22 years now since that July day in 2001, but I remember it clearer than what I had for breakfast this morning. My name's Zach Turner. I was 15 that summer, about to start my sophomore year at Pinevale High. Mom had been dating Scott Rayburn for about 8 months by then. Nice enough guy, worked construction, liked fishing, and had a weird obsession with finding gold in mountain streams. He'd gotten this idea about panning, then upgraded to what he called recreational dredging in the creeks up in Wyoming's snowy range. That's how we ended up spending a week of my summer vacation camping in the middle of nowhere. Mom, Scott, his buddies Dale and Terry's wife Brenda. I was the only kid, but I didn't mind. I'd been hoping to hang out with my friends back home, but Mom insisted this would be character building. The campsite wasn't bad. A clearing surrounded by tall pines with mountains rising in the distance. Scott had brought his old four-wheeler for me to use. "Stay close to camp," Mom had warned. "These mountains are no joke." It was July 14th, hot even at that elevation. Scott and his friends had been working their dredge setup in a creek about half a mile from our campsite. I'd watched them for the first couple days, but honestly, watching grown men sift through mud gets boring fast. "I'm going to take the four-wheeler for a ride," I told Mom after lunch. She was reading a paperback thriller in a folding chair. "Don't go far," she said, without looking up, "and be back before dark." I grabbed a bottle of water and my baseball cap. The four-wheeler started with a satisfying rumble. I rode past Scott and his crew at the creek. Dale waved, his arms mud-covered to the elbows. "Just exploring a bit," I called out. "Stay on the paths," Scott replied. "Easy to get turned around out here." I followed the main dirt road for a while before noticing a narrower path branching off between the trees. It looked interesting, less traveled, but still clear enough to follow. I turned onto it, ducking low branches as the four-wheeler rumbled deeper into the forest. The woods grew thicker the further I went. Pine and spruce crowded in, and the path narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the vehicle. The ground became rockier, with roots snaking across the trail. I slowed down, realizing I'd gone farther than planned. The forest had grown quiet. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just the engine's rumble and my own breathing. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating a green-tinted dimness that made it hard to judge the time. A chill ran up my spine despite the summer heat. "This is dumb," I muttered to myself. "Time to head back." I eased the four-wheeler to a stop and turned it around on the narrow trail. That's when I noticed movement ahead of me. A small black bear cub, probably 40 pounds, ambled onto the path. My hands tightened on the handlebars. Where there's a cub, there's usually a mama bear. The little guy approached my four-wheeler, not normal behavior at all. It pressed its body against the front tire and started shaking. At first I thought it was aggressive, but then I realized the cub was scared. Terrified, actually. It kept looking back over its shoulder. Before I could process this, a much larger bear, definitely mama, charged out of the woods about 20 feet away. She was huge, at least 300 pounds of muscle and fur. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. I was dead. But she didn't attack. The mother bear rushed to her cub, nudged it forcefully away from my four-wheeler, and herded it across the path. They both disappeared into the underbrush on the other side. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. What stuck with me was their eyes. Both bears looked scared. Not cautious of humans, not annoyed at being disturbed. Genuinely frightened of something. That's when I heard it. The scream started as a low, guttural roar, like a mountain lion, but deeper, more powerful. It built quickly into something else entirely. The pitch rose higher and higher until it became a piercing shriek, like a woman being murdered, but amplified to an impossible volume. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the mountains, making it impossible to tell where it came from. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the throttle. I twisted it hard, almost falling as the four-wheeler lurched forward. I didn't care about branches whipping my face or the risk of hitting a tree. I just needed to get back to camp. The screaming continued behind me, that impossible sound that started animal and ended human, over and over. I burst out of the narrow trail onto the main dirt road, pushing the four-wheeler to its limit. I passed Scott's crew at the creek. They weren't working anymore. All three men stood frozen, faces pale, staring in the direction I'd just come from. The screaming had stopped by then. "You hear that?" Dale called out as I slowed. "Yeah!" I shouted back, not wanting to stop. "I'm heading back to camp." As I passed, I noticed the bears, the same mother and cub, splashing across the creek downstream. They were moving fast, putting distance between themselves and whatever made that sound. I continued on, reaching the meadow that opened up before our campsite. Slowing down to catch my breath, I turned to look back at the forest edge. That's when I saw it. Standing just inside the tree line was a figure, tall, much taller than a man, 7, maybe 8 feet high. Dark brown or black, I couldn't tell in the shadows, but it stood upright, on 2 legs. For a moment we just stared at each other. I couldn't make out its face clearly, just the massive outline of something decidedly not human, watching me from the darkness between the trees. Then it moved. It turned and began striding up the mountainside behind it. Not running exactly, but moving with purpose, fast, impossibly fast for something that size, navigating steep, densely forested terrain. I heard branches snapping, undergrowth crushing beneath heavy footfalls. It crashed through the forest with the force of a bulldozer, but the agility of a deer. Within seconds, it had covered ground that would have taken me 10 minutes to hike. Then it was gone, leaving only the sound of disturbed forest settling back into place. I gunned the four-wheeler the rest of the way to camp. Mum looked up from her book when I skidded to a stop. "You're back early," she said, then frowned. "What happened to your face?" My hand went to my cheek. It came away bloody from the branches that had whipped me during my escape. "Just caught some branches," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there any water left in the cooler?" I didn't tell Mom what happened. What could I say? I saw Bigfoot. She'd think I was making it up, or worse, that I'd hit my head. When Scott and the others returned to camp an hour later, I pulled him aside. "Did you guys hear that screaming?" I asked quietly. Scott's normally tanned face looked pale. "Yeah, never heard anything like it before." "I saw something too," I said, "by the tree line. Big, standing on 2 legs. His eyes narrowed. Probably a bear." It wasn't a bear. I described how it moved, how fast it climbed the mountain. Scott was quiet for a moment. "Let's keep this between us, all right? Don't want to freak out your mom or Brenda." I nodded, relieved he didn't dismiss me outright. "We're heading out tomorrow anyway," he added. "One more night won't kill us." But Scott couldn't leave it alone. After dinner, while Mom and the others played cards, he pulled me aside again. "Show me where you saw it," he said. I hesitated. "Now, it's getting dark." "Just to the meadow. We'll take my truck." We made an excuse about checking the four-wheeler for damage and drove out to where I'd seen the figure. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple. It was right there. I pointed to the tree line, and it went up that way. Scott squinted up at the mountainside. "That's a hell of a climb." We walked to the edge of the trees. I didn't want to go any further, but Scott pressed on, about 20 yards into the forest. I followed reluctantly. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The area looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Trees, not saplings but full-grown pines, were ripped sideways, some torn completely from the ground, with root systems exposed. Branches were snapped off, undergrowth flattened. A path of destruction led straight up the mountainside. "A bear didn't do this," I said. Scott picked up a broken branch, nearly as thick as my arm. It had been snapped clean, not chewed or clawed. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." We didn't stay long. The forest was getting dark, and neither of us wanted to be there after sunset. We drove back to camp in silence. That night, I didn't sleep. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind through the trees had me wide-eyed, staring at the roof of my tent. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Far off, maybe miles away, but unmistakable. That raw, turned scream. No one else seemed to wake. The next morning, we packed up early. No one mentioned the scream except Dale, who made a joke about mountain lions being extra angry these days. Scott caught my eye and gave a slight headshake. Our secret. On the drive home, Mum asked if I'd had fun. Yeah, I lied. It was cool. Scott says maybe next summer we can try somewhere new, she said. Maybe Yellowstone. I nodded, but I knew I'd never camp in those mountains again. Years passed. Mum and Scott eventually broke up. I graduated high school, went to community college, got a job in IT. Normal life stuff, but I never forgot what happened in the snowy range. I've researched it since then. Found other stories, hunters, hikers, campers who heard those same screams. Some who saw something big moving through the trees. They call it Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Skookum. Scientists say they're all misidentifications or hoaxes. But scientists weren't there that day. They didn't see the fear in those bears' eyes. They didn't hear that sound, that impossible sound that started animal and ended human. They didn't see the thing standing in the trees, watching me. They didn't see what it did to the forest just by passing through it. I know what I experienced. Something was in those woods, something that doesn't fit into our understanding of the natural world. Something powerful enough to frighten predators and destroy trees like they were toothpicks. I've never gone back to the snowy range. Never will. But sometimes when I'm half asleep, I hear that scream again, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the tree line, waiting for someone else to wander down the wrong path. Sometimes I think about that bear cub, pressing against my four-wheeler, shaking with fear. It knew something I didn't, that there are things in this world far more dangerous than humans, things that prefer to stay hidden in the deep woods and high mountains, things that occasionally reveal themselves, just for a moment, to remind us that we don't know nearly as much about this world as we think we do.